I am Tara Caldwell, and at 32 years old, I watched my father scream in agony on Father's Day, surrounded by the wealthiest people in Atlanta. He stood in front of our entire family and our elite guests to announce that he was proud of all his children except the disgrace sitting at his table. That disgrace was me. When nobody defended me, I did not cry or beg for his love. I simply smiled, handed him a thick envelope, wished him a happy Father's Day, and walked away. Moments later, as my chauffeured car pulled out of the driveway, he opened it. The scream that ripped from his lungs was so loud, the neighbors rushed out of their mansions in a panic. He had no idea what was inside that envelope, but it was exactly what he deserved. If you have ever been the scapegoat of a toxic family, stay here and listen to how I took back my power. The annual Caldwell Father's Day barbecue was never really about celebrating my father Elijah. It was a meticulously curated stage play designed to showcase our family to the upper crust of Atlanta society. My parents lived in a $4 million estate in the historic Cascade neighborhood, a sprawling property with a pristine lawn, a grand driveway, and towering oak trees that shielded their secrets from the world. Growing up in that house meant adhering to the strict doctrine of Black excellence, or at least my father's twisted version of it. You were either a shining trophy for him to display, or you were an embarrassment to be hidden away. Today, the backyard was transformed into a luxury country club. A live jazz band played softly near the infinity pool, while white-gloved waiters circulated with expensive champagne and hors d'oeuvres. The guest list included local judges, mega church pastors, and old money socialites. My mother Vivian was in her element. She glided between groups of guests wearing a designer sundress, adjusting her perfect hair, and managing the family image with ruthless efficiency. She introduced my older brother Andre to everyone as the brilliant vice president of Caldwell Logistics, making sure to emphasize his degree. Beside him stood my younger sister Brianna, snapping photos for her massive social media following posing with her husband Connor. Connor was a story all his own. He was a white finance broker from a supposedly wealthy family, and my father treated him like a deity who had descended from Wall Street to bless our family. Elijah believed that having a white son-in-law in the finance sector elevated our status, giving Caldwell Logistics the kind of corporate legitimacy he desperately craved. Connor played the part perfectly, projecting an air of arrogant superiority while secretly looking down on all of us. I could see the smug satisfaction on his face as he swirled his drink, accepting the fawning praise of my parents. And then there was me. I sat quietly at the edge of the main dining table, wearing a simple tailored dress, nursing a glass of sparkling water. I was the anomaly. I had refused to join the family business and walked away from their controlling grasp years ago. In their eyes, I was a struggling consultant running some imaginary business out of a cramped apartment. They did not know that I had spent the last decade building a venture capital firm from the ground up, orchestrating massive mergers and acquisitions across the country. They did not know about my penthouse or my bank accounts. I kept my true life hidden because I knew my father would only try to claim credit for it or destroy it. The clinking of a silver spoon against a crystal champagne flute cut through the chatter. The jazz band stopped playing and the guests turned their attention to the head of the long table. My father stood tall and imposing, wearing a custom linen suit that matched his inflated ego. He soaked in the respectful silence of the crowd before raising his glass. Thank you all for joining us today to celebrate family legacy and hard work. Elijah began, his voice booming with the practiced cadence of a seasoned preacher. Looking around this yard, I am filled with pride. Caldwell Logistics has just closed our most profitable quarter in history. We are expanding across the entire region, and that growth is driven by the next generation. He gestured grandly toward my brother. Andre, my son, you have taken the reins as vice president with incredible skill. You are the future of this company, and you carry the Caldwell name with honor. The crowd applauded politely. I took a slow sip of my water, knowing full well that Andre was wildly incompetent. He spent his days playing golf and delegating his actual work to underpaid assistants. But in my father's narrative, Andre was a business prodigy. Elijah then turned his attention to my sister and her husband, and to my beautiful daughter Brianna and her brilliant husband Connor. Connor, you brought your Wall Street prestige into our family. Your financial guidance is a blessing, and we are thrilled to see the empire you are building together. Connor offered a modest nod that was anything but humble. Happy Father's Day. Elijah, he called out, raising his glass. We are just happy to elevate the family portfolio. The guests murmured their approval, charmed by the display of wealth and unity. Then the atmosphere shifted. My father's gaze swept past the golden children and landed squarely on me. The warmth drained from his face, replaced by a familiar look of disdain. The silence stretched, becoming heavy and uncomfortable as people noticed the change in his demeanor. And then there is Tara, my father said, his voice dropping an octave but amplifying in cruelty. 32 years old, no husband, no real assets, running some imaginary consulting gig that nobody can quite figure out. The crowd shifted uneasily. My mother looked away, pretending to be highly interested in her napkin. When my fraternity brothers ask what my middle daughter does, I have to look down in shame. Elijah continued, the words striking like physical blows. In a family that represents excellence, you stand out as a profound disappointment. You contribute nothing to our legacy. You are a disgrace to the Caldwell name, and frankly, I am tired of making excuses for your failures. The sheer brutality of his words hung in the humid Atlanta air. A few people gasped softly, but no one spoke up. Not the pastors who preached about unconditional love, not my mother who had carried me for 9 months, not my siblings who had watched me take the brunt of his anger our entire lives. They all sat in complicit silence, letting me bear the weight of his public scorn. The uncomfortable quiet was broken by a sharp, condescending chuckle. Connor leaned across the table, a smug grin plastered across his face. He reached into his designer wallet, pulled out a crisp $100 bill, and slid it across the mahogany table until it rested directly in front of my plate. If you are struggling that badly, Tara, my firm is actually looking for a new receptionist, Connor said, his voice loud enough for the surrounding tables to hear. You always were good at fetching coffee for Andre back in college. It pays minimum wage, but it is honest work for someone with your limited skill set. You can keep the 100 to buy some decent clothes for the interview. Brianna let out a loud, dramatic laugh, leaning into Connor's shoulder. Andre smirked, shaking his head. Several guests chuckled nervously, desperate to break the tension by going along with the joke. The racial and class dynamics of the moment were sickening. Here was this mediocre white man who had married into our wealth, openly degrading a black woman at her own family table, while her father nodded in approval. Connor felt completely untouchable, shielded by his fabricated Wall Street pedigree and my father's desperate need for his validation. I stared at the $100 bill resting against my pristine white plate. For a fraction of a second, the ghost of the little girl who just wanted her father's love felt a familiar ache in her chest. But that girl had died a long time ago. The woman sitting in that chair was a financial predator who had dismantled corporations twice the size of Caldwell Logistics before breakfast. I looked at my mother, hoping for just a flicker of maternal defense. Vivian simply frowned and whispered for me to put the money away and stop causing a scene. She blamed me for being insulted. That was the final confirmation I needed. There was nothing left to salvage here. No relationship worth saving. No bridge left unburned. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice or throw a tantrum. I calmly picked up my linen napkin, wiped my mouth, and stood up from the table. The movement drew the eyes of every single person in the yard. They expected a breakdown. They expected me to run away in tears, just as I had done when I was a teenager. Instead, I reached into my bag and retrieved a thick, heavy manila envelope. I walked slowly around the long dining table, the clicking of my heels against the stone patio, cutting through the absolute silence. I stopped right next to my father's chair. He looked up at me, his expression defiant, daring me to talk back. I ignored the $100 bill Connor had thrown at me. I looked down at the man who had spent 3 decades trying to make me feel small. Happy Father's Day, Dad. I said, my voice perfectly calm, carrying clearly across the quiet yard. "I got you exactly what you deserve." I dropped the thick envelope directly onto his dinner plate, right on top of his expensive steak. The thud of the paper hitting the porcelain echoed in the quiet yard. I did not wait for him to open it. I did not wait for a reaction. I simply turned around and walked away. I kept my posture flawless, my head held high as I navigated the winding stone path toward the front of the estate. I could feel the bewildered stares of 100 guests burning into my back, but I did not falter. I walked through the massive iron gates of the property where my chauffeured Mercedes Maybach was already idling at the curb. The driver opened the door for me. I slid into the luxurious leather back seat, and the door closed with a solid, reassuring thud, shutting out the toxic world I had just left behind. As the massive engine of the Maybach purred to life and the car began to glide smoothly down the tree-lined street, the tranquility of the afternoon was suddenly violently shattered. A scream ripped through the air. It was not a yell of anger. It was a visceral, blood-curdling shriek of pure, unadulterated terror. It came from the backyard of the estate. It was my father. The sound was so loud and so full of agony that I saw neighbors stepping out onto their grand balconies and rushing down their driveways looking around in a panic. The jazz music abruptly stopped. The sound of breaking glass and panicked shouting followed. Inside the serene quiet of my car, my phone screen lit up. My assistant was calling. I answered, looking out the window as the trees blurred past. "Boss, the IRS asset freeze documents and the bank foreclosure notices were in the envelope just as you requested," she said, her tone efficient and sharp. "Shall we proceed with the next phase of the acquisition?" "Yes, proceed," I replied, a genuine smile finally touching my lips. "Let them panic." Before I could set the phone down, a text message popped up on the screen. It was from Andre. The message was a frantic block of desperate letters. "What the hell did you give Dad? He is having a heart attack. He is clutching his chest and screaming that he is going to kill me and Connor. The paramedics are on their way. What did you do, Tara?" I locked my phone and tossed it onto the empty leather seat beside me. I leaned back, closing my eyes and letting the gentle hum of the car soothe me. For 32 years, they had treated me like dirt. They had starved me of affection, ridiculed my ambitions, and propped up their own fragile egos by stepping on my neck. They thought they had broken me. They thought I was a failure because I refused to play a supporting role in their theater of lies. They had no idea that while they were busy playing dress-up and congratulating themselves on their fake wealth, I was silently buying up the very ground they walked on. The envelope I left at his feet contained the absolute destruction of the Caldwell empire. It contained the foreclosure deeds, the offshore account traces, and the undeniable proof that their entire world was built on fraud and stolen money. The explosion at the barbecue was just the opening act. The real devastation was only just beginning. The war was officially over, and I had won before they even realized we were fighting. I woke up the next morning to the soft hum of the city far below my Buckhead penthouse. The sunlight filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows, painting the hardwood floors in strokes of gold. I stood in the kitchen looking out over the sprawling canopy of Atlanta trees, a stark contrast to the concrete jungle I dominated every single day. I poured myself a cup of black coffee from the espresso machine, my movements slow and deliberate. There was no rush today. The trap had already been set, and the prey was currently thrashing blindly in the snare. My personal cell phone began to vibrate violently against the cold marble of the kitchen island. The caller ID displayed a name I had not saved in my contacts for nearly a decade but recognized instantly. It was my mother, Vivian. I let it ring. I watched the phone vibrate, rotating slightly on the smooth surface, listening to the steady buzzing sound. It stopped. Then it started again, immediately. She was desperate. I took another sip of my coffee, letting the bitter warmth ground me before I finally swiped the screen to accept the call. I did not even have a chance to say a single word before her voice shattered the quiet morning peace of my apartment. "Tara, what have you done?" she screamed into the receiver. Her voice was hysterical, but it was that highly specific brand of wealthy panic where the fear of public embarrassment completely eclipses any actual tragedy. Do you have any idea what is happening here right now? Your father has been up all night long clutching his chest and dry heaving in his office. He is refusing to go to the hospital because he is terrified the neighbors will see the ambulance pulling into the driveway. Do you understand that? He thinks he is having a heart attack and he would rather die in his leather chair than let the people next door know we have a problem. I remained silent, letting her rant into the phone. The police were at the gates this morning, Tara. She shrieked, abandoning any pretense of maternal affection or Southern grace. The Internal Revenue Service sent a notice of asset seizure. Do you realize what this means for us? We are supposed to host the country club summer gala next weekend. The mayor is attending. The governor is sending a representative. How am I supposed to show my face at the club when there are federal notices taped to our front doors? You need to call whoever you paid to make these fake documents and tell them to call it off right now. Tell them it was a prank. I took a slow sip of my coffee. I assume he opened his father's day gift then. You vindictive little brat, my mother yelled, her voice cracking under the strain of maintaining her delusions. I know exactly why you are doing this. You have always been jealous. You have always been bitter that you never fit in with the rest of this family. Are you seriously doing all of this just because I used your college fund to buy Andre his first Mercedes? Is that what this is about? You hold a grudge for 14 years over a stupid car, and now you want to make fake IRS reports to humiliate your own flesh and blood. You are sick, Tara. You need psychological help. The sheer audacity of her statement almost made me laugh out loud. 14 years ago, I had worked 3 part-time jobs in high school while maintaining a perfect grade point average. I had saved every single penny into a joint account my mother controlled, waiting to pay my tuition for a top-tier university. The summer before my freshman year, I went to the bank to get a cashier's check for my first semester, and the teller told me the account was empty. When I confronted her, she did not even apologize. She told me that Andre needed a reliable luxury car to drive to his new internship so he would look the part of a successful young executive. She told me I could just take out student loans because I was smart enough to figure it out on my own, while Andre needed the extra support to shine. That was the exact moment I realized I was not a daughter to her. I was just a disposable resource to be mined for the benefit of her golden son. I set my coffee mug down on the counter, the ceramic making a sharp clink in the quiet kitchen. I am not holding a grudge over a car, Mom, I said, my voice dangerously calm. And those documents are not fake. You need to ask your golden boy Andre and your perfect white son-in-law Connor where the $15 million in missing company taxes actually went. The silence on the other end of the line was absolute. I could almost hear the gears turning in her head as she tried to process the massive number I had just spoken. $15 million, what are you talking about? She finally whispered, her voice trembling with genuine fear this time. I did not report Caldwell Logistics to the IRS. I explained, speaking slowly and clearly, as if I were explaining a simple addition problem to a very slow child. The federal government found that discrepancy entirely on their own because Connor and Andre are arrogant and sloppy. They thought they were untouchable. But the bank foreclosing on your house today, that was me. Caldwell Logistics was drowning in bad debt, Mom. They leveraged everything they had to keep up appearances for people who do not even care about them. Your luxury cars, your European vacations, the very house you are standing in right now. It was all put up as collateral against massive corporate loans they could not pay back. When the bank categorized that debt as toxic and moved to write it off, I was the venture capitalist who swooped in and bought it for pennies on the dollar through a blind proxy firm. I am your primary creditor now. I own your house. I own the cars. I own everything. No, you do not, she screamed, her denial kicking in as a desperate defense mechanism. You are a nobody, Tara. You run a tiny little consulting firm out of a rented apartment somewhere downtown. You do not have that kind of money. You are lying. You are a disgusting liar who is trying to destroy this family because you could never measure up to your sister. I let her vent her poison entirely unfazed. I am going to call Reverend Davis, she threatened, her voice rising to a frantic pitch. I am going to have you excommunicated from the church. I am going to the Jack and Jill Society Board, and I will make sure your name is mud in Atlanta. I will call every single contact I have. You will never show your face in polite society again. You will be a pariah. I will make sure nobody ever hires your fake little consulting firm ever again. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking down at the tiny cars navigating the busy streets of Atlanta far below my balcony. Go ahead and call them Mom, I said, my tone perfectly flat. Call the Reverend. Call the Society Board. Call the country club president. But while you have them on the phone, you might want to explain to them exactly how you funded your fabulous little lifestyle. What do you mean? She snapped defensively. My husband built a logistics empire. We earned our wealth. Do you want to know the real reason your designer closet is overflowing with Birkin bags and custom Chanel suits? Mom, I asked, not waiting for her to answer. It is not because Dad is a business genius. It is because they have been illegally dipping into the employee pension fund for the last 4 years to cover their massive cash flow shortages. You have literally been wearing the retirement savings of the warehouse workers on your back. Your entire social standing is funded by theft from the working-class black men and women your husband employs. How do you think the church ladies will respond to that piece of gossip once the federal indictments go public on the evening news? She gasped, a ragged, terrible sound of a woman watching her entire fabricated reality shatter into pieces. She had spent her entire adult life curating an image of untouchable perfection, and in less than 3 minutes I had dismantled it down to the studs. Tara, please, she begged, her voice dropping into a pathetic, broken whimper. You cannot do this. You cannot let them take the house. Where will I go? What will I tell my friends? You are my daughter. You have to fix this. You have to call off your lawyers. I was entirely done with the conversation. The sound of her pleading made me feel nothing at all. I ended the call without another word, cutting off her desperate begging mid-sentence. I stood in the quiet of my kitchen, feeling the residual adrenaline coursing through my veins. The first domino had officially fallen, and the complete destruction of the Caldwell legacy was unfolding exactly according to my projections. They were turning on each other just as I knew they would when the money dried up. Suddenly, the second line on my mahogany desk phone began to flash. The caller ID displayed Connor Foster. I walked over to the desk and looked at the blinking red light. I did not pick up the receiver. I simply watched it flash, listening to the mechanical ringing until it rolled over to my voicemail system. A minute later, an encrypted audio file dropped into my secure inbox. I sat down in my leather desk chair, clicked play, and the sound of my white brother-in-law's voice filled the vast room. He was breathless and furious. He was no longer attempting to hide his true nature behind his usual polished Southern charm and fake progressive allyship. The mask had completely slipped, revealing the entitled, arrogant predator underneath. "Listen to me, you stupid little urban startup hack," he snarled into the phone, the thinly veiled racism bleeding through every syllable. "I do not know what kind of ghetto stunt you think you are pulling with your father, but you have messed with the wrong guy. I am not one of these local Atlanta amateurs you can bully with some fake paperwork. I have elite Wall Street lawyers on speed dial. My family has been destroying people like you for generations. If you do not reverse whatever illegal banking freeze you put on my accounts, I will bury you so deep in litigation you will not even be able to afford a public defender. You think you can take me down because you bought some bad debt. I will crush your little firm, and I will ruin your life. Do you hear me? I will end you." The message ended with a violent click. I smiled, staring at the digital audio file on my sleek computer screen. I forwarded the recording directly to my lead corporate litigator with a single instruction attached. It was almost cute how thoroughly Connor underestimated the situation. He thought he was dealing with an angry sister throwing a tantrum. He had absolutely no idea that I already controlled the board, I already controlled the debt, and I already possessed the digital footprint that would send him to federal prison for a decade. The white knight of the Caldwell family was about to fall, and I was going to enjoy watching him hit the ground. The flashing red light on my console had barely stopped blinking from the voicemail when the sharp chime of an incoming video request echoed through my penthouse office. It was Connor again. Apparently, leaving a recorded threat was not enough to soothe his bruised ego. He needed an audience. He needed to see me cower. I took a deep breath, savoring the quiet power of the moment, smoothed the lapels of my tailored blazer, and clicked accept. The large monitor on my wall flickered to life. Connor was sitting at the head of a massive glass table in his downtown financial firm. The floor-to-ceiling windows behind him offered a panoramic view of the city, a view he believed he owned. He was leaning back in his ergonomic chair, the very picture of unearned confidence. His sleeves were rolled up just enough to display the expensive platinum watch on his wrist, the one Brianna had proudly posted about on her social media last Christmas, claiming it was a symbol of their hard work. I knew for a fact it was paid for with a diverted payroll account. Tara, he began, his voice dripping with a sickly, sweet condescension that made my skin crawl. I am so glad you picked up. I was starting to think you were hiding from me. I am right here, Connor, I replied, my tone perfectly level. I crossed my legs and rested my hands on my desk, letting the silence stretch. I gave him absolutely nothing to work with, no anger, no fear, no defensiveness. It unsettled him. I could see the slight twitch in his jaw as he realized I was not reacting the way my family usually did. Look, I am going to do you a favor, he said, leaning forward and resting his elbows on the glass table. He lowered his voice, adopting the tone of a patient teacher explaining a difficult concept to a slow student. I understand you are upset. Your father is a difficult man. Your family has a lot of dramatic issues. But you have stepped entirely out of your depth here. You think because you run some little urban startup that you can play in the big leagues. You bought some bad paper. Congratulations. But trying to use it to extort me, that is where your little game ends. He paused, waiting for me to apologize or backtrack. When I remained silent, he continued, his arrogance swelling to fill the room. My family has been in this city for 4 generations, Tara. We build buildings. We sit on boards. I have elite lawyers who eat amateur consultants like you for breakfast. If you do not lift whatever ridiculous hold you placed on my accounts, I am going to bury you. I will tie you up in so much litigation you will be bankrupt before the holidays. You will lose your little apartment, your little business, and whatever scrap of dignity you have left. He leaned back again, lacing his fingers together behind his head. A self-satisfied smirk spread across his face. I elevated this family when I married Brianna. He sneered, the ugly truth of his prejudice finally spilling out into the open. You people would be absolutely nothing without my financial guidance. Your father was running a glorified delivery service before I stepped in and brought Wall Street prestige to the table. I gave you legitimacy. You should be thanking me instead of throwing these pathetic tantrums. I let his words hang in the air, letting him hear the echo of his own profound ignorance. He truly believed he was the savior of the Caldwell family. He believed his white skin and his country club membership made him intellectually superior to everyone in my bloodline. He was so blinded by his own privilege that he could not even conceive of the fact that the trap he was standing in had been built by the very woman he was currently insulting. Are you finished? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, but carrying the weight of an absolute zero winter chill. Connor dropped his hands to the table, his smirk faltering slightly at my lack of reaction. I am giving you one chance to fix this, Tara. I reached for the mouse on my desk. I think it is time we look at some actual numbers, Connor. I am going to share my screen with you. I hope your elite lawyers are watching. I clicked a button and the video feed shifted, pushing Connor's face to a small box in the corner of the monitor. The main screen filled with a series of complex banking spreadsheets highlighted with bright red and yellow markers. These were not public records. These were the highly guarded encrypted internal ledgers of Connor's personal hedge fund, paired directly with the outgoing accounts payable files from Caldwell Logistics. What is this? He demanded, his voice losing its smooth cadence. Where did you get this? This, I said, keeping my voice calm and surgical, is the routing history for a company called Apex Freight Solutions. According to my father's books, Apex Freight has been handling 30% of our regional transport for the last 3 years. They bill Caldwell Logistics approximately $5 million annually. I click to the next slide. The only problem, Connor, is that Apex Freight Solutions does not own any trucks. They do not own any warehouses. They do not have any employees. It is a shell company registered to a post office box in Delaware. And if we follow the routing numbers from the invoices you personally approved as the family financial advisor, we see that the money goes from Caldwell Logistics directly into a holding account in the Cayman Islands. I watched the small box in the corner of my screen. The color was rapidly draining from Connor's face. His arrogant posture had vanished entirely. He was sitting bolt upright, staring at the screen as if it were a venomous snake. From the Cayman Islands, I continued, my voice steady and rhythmic. The funds are dispersed into 3 separate portfolios, managed by your personal hedge fund. Over the last 3 years, you have siphoned exactly $15.4 million from my father's company. You used fake vendors to launder the money right under his nose. Tara, you are misunderstanding these documents, he stammered, a fine sheen of sweat breaking out on his forehead. This is complex corporate restructuring. It is tax mitigation. You do not understand how high-level finance works. I clicked to the next slide, displaying a series of high-definition photographs and wire transfer receipts. I understand perfectly how fraud works, Connor. I understand that the missing $15 million was used to fund the lavish lifestyle you and my sister parade around the internet. The down payment on your Buckhead mansion came directly from the Caldwell Employee Pension Fund, which you advised my father to leverage. Brianna's diamond necklaces, her designer bags, the spontaneous trips to Dubai, you paid for all of it with stolen money to play the role of the wealthy white savior. You did not elevate our family. You hollowed it out from the inside and wore it like a costume. Connor was breathing heavily now, his eyes darting frantically around his office as if looking for an escape route. The reality of his situation was finally crashing through the walls of his privilege. The documents on the screen were irrefutable. They were not just financial statements, they were a complete detailed map of his criminal enterprise, complete with his digital signatures and authorization codes. "Listen to me, Tara," he said, his voice cracking, raising his hands in a placating gesture. He was no longer the arrogant Wall Street titan. He was a cornered rat. "We can work this out." "Okay. You are a smart woman. I can see that now. I underestimated you and I apologize. But we are family. We do not need to tear each other apart over this." Family. I repeated the word, tasting like ash in my mouth. "You sat at my table yesterday and threw $100 bill at me. You told me to fetch coffee. You do not get to use the word family when the walls are closing in." "I can give you a cut," he blurted out, desperation making him reckless. "If you own the debt, we can restructure the holding company. I can wire you $2 million right now. $3 million. We can keep this between us. The old man does not need to know. He is retiring soon anyway. We can take over the whole board. Just you and me." I stared at him, feeling a deep, profound disgust. He was willing to sell out my father, my brother, and his own wife in a matter of seconds just to save his own skin. He had absolutely no loyalty to anyone but himself. "You do not have $3 million to give me, Connor," I said, leaning back in my chair. "I have the liquidity," he insisted, frantically pulling a secondary laptop toward him. "I can initiate the wire transfer right now. Just tell me where to send it. Just take down those screens and we have a deal." I let him type furiously for a few seconds before I delivered the final blow. "I did not just buy my father's bad debt, Connor," I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. "As the primary creditor of Caldwell Logistics, I initiated an emergency asset freeze on all connected accounts due to suspected embezzlement. I filed the injunction at 4 in the morning. A federal judge signed off on it at 6. Connor stopped typing. He looked up slowly, his eyes wide with a terror that was deeply satisfying to witness. "I do not need a cut of your stolen money," I told him, meeting his panicked gaze through the camera lens. "I just froze your entire portfolio. Your domestic accounts are locked. Your offshore accounts have been flagged by international banking authorities. Even the credit cards in your wallet are currently declining. You cannot wire me $3 million because you do not have 3 cents to your name. You are broke, Connor. No, he breathed, shaking his head, his hands trembling against his desk. No, you cannot do that. You do not have the authority. You are bluffing. I am not the one who bluffs, I replied coldly. I am the one who finishes the game. He started hyperventilating, pulling at the collar of his expensive custom-tailored shirt as if it were suddenly choking him. The walls of his glass office felt like a cage. He reached for his desk phone, likely to call his elite lawyers, but I knew it was too late. I had timed this conversation perfectly. The wheels of federal justice move slowly, but when guided by undeniable, pristine financial evidence provided by a top-tier venture capital firm, they moved with devastating precision. Tara, please, you have to reverse this, he begged, tears actually forming in the corners of his eyes. Brianna will leave me. I will lose my license. I will go to jail. Please, I will do whatever you want. I will sign everything over to you. You have nothing left to sign over. I told him the absolute finality of my words hanging in the air between us. You built your life on the backs of my family thinking we were too stupid to notice. You used our name to build your credibility while mocking us behind our backs. Now you get to experience what happens when the people you underestimate decide to stop playing by your rules. Through the video feed, I saw movement in the background of Connor's office. Beyond the glass walls of his pristine suite, the heavy wooden doors of his reception area swung open violently. Connor turned his head, looking over his shoulder. I watched the scene unfold in perfect high definition. Several men and women wearing tactical gear and dark windbreakers strode into the office. The bold yellow letters spelling out FBI were clearly visible across their backs. They were moving with aggressive purpose, carrying thick manila folders and evidence boxes. The receptionist tried to stand up but was immediately ordered back to her seat. Two agents broke away from the main group and headed straight down the glass hallway toward Connor's private suite. Connor whipped his head back to the camera, his face a mask of absolute horror. Tara, he screamed, reaching toward the screen as if I could somehow pull him through it and save him. I leaned forward, my face perfectly composed. Enjoy the big leagues, Connor, I said. I reached for my mouse and ended the call, just as the heavy glass doors of his office were kicked open by the federal agents. The screen went black, cutting off his panicked screams and plunging my penthouse office back into a serene, victorious silence. I sat back in my chair, closing my eyes and exhaling a long, slow breath. The White Knight had officially fallen from his pedestal. His wealth, his reputation, and his arrogant illusions of superiority had been shattered into pieces that could never be put back together. The federal government was currently seizing every asset he had ever touched, and by the end of the day, his face would be plastered across every financial news network in the country. But the operation was not complete. Connor was only one head of the Hydra. He had stolen the money, but he had not done it alone. He had required an inside man, someone with enough authority at Caldwell Logistics, to authorize the fake invoices and bypass the accounting protocols. Someone who was so desperate to maintain the illusion of success that he was willing to betray his own father to do it. My phone buzzed again, lighting up the dark surface of my desk. The screen displayed a notification from Instagram. Brianna Caldwell Foster was currently broadcasting live to her 2 million followers. I picked up the phone, swiping to open the application. It was time to deal with the influencer. It was time to strip away the final layer of fake perfection and expose the rot that my mother had spent decades trying to protect. I tapped the screen, joining the live broadcast, and watched my sister smiling into the camera, completely unaware that her entire universe was about to collapse in real time. The digital execution of Connor was flawless and absolute, but my work for the day was far from over. I pivoted my desk chair toward the secondary monitor mounted on my office wall. It was time to deal with my younger sister. Brianna was currently live on Instagram, broadcasting to her 2 million loyal followers from the custom-built glam room inside the mansion she shared with Connor. Her entire life was a carefully constructed exhibition of fabricated wealth, and I was about to cancel the show. I unmuted the monitor and leaned back, listening to the sickeningly sweet pitch of her voice. She was sitting in front of a massive vanity mirror framed by bright, LED ring lights, wearing a silk robe and a full face of flawless makeup. The live chat was scrolling so fast, it was a blur of heart emojis and adoring comments. Brianna clapped her perfectly manicured hands together, displaying a massive velvet jewelry box resting on the marble counter in front of her. "Hey everyone," she cooed into the camera, her smile painfully wide. "I just had to jump on live today because Connor completely surprised me this morning. You all know how hard my husband works at his firm. He is always at the office building his portfolio and providing for our family. Well, today he told me he wanted to celebrate our anniversary a little early. I have not even opened this yet, but I wanted to share this unboxing with my favorite people in the world." I watched the screen with cold detachment. She reached for the velvet box, peeling back the lid with exaggerated slowness to build suspense for her audience. Inside, resting on a bed of black satin, was a blindingly bright diamond collar necklace. The stones caught the harsh ring light and refracted a dozen different colors into the camera lens. It was easily $100,000 piece. Brianna gasped, covering her mouth with her hand, performing the exact routine of shocked humility she had perfected over the years. "Oh my goodness!" she squealed, lifting the heavy diamond collar from the box and holding it up against her collarbone. "I cannot believe he did this. Connor is literally the most amazing husband on the planet. This is why you wait for a man who knows how to treat a queen, ladies. Let me put this on so you can see how it catches the light." She fumbled with the clasp, securing the diamonds around her neck, and posing for the camera. The chat was exploding with praise and envy. People were calling her lucky, calling her blessed, calling her goals. It was the ultimate validation loop for a woman who possessed absolutely zero internal substance. But the performance was about to experience a severe interruption. Through the high-definition audio feed, I heard the heavy, unmistakable sound of her bedroom doors being forced open. The noise was loud enough to make Brianna jump and look over her shoulder. Her expression shifted from manicured joy to genuine confusion as heavy footsteps echoed on the hardwood floors outside her glam room. "Excuse me, what are you doing in my house?" she demanded, her voice dropping its sweet pitch and snapping into the entitled tone she used with service workers. "You cannot be in here." The camera angle was fixed on Brianna, but the mirror behind her reflected the doorway. I watched as 3 men and 1 woman walked into the frame. They were not wearing tactical gear like the agents who had taken Connor, but they were dressed in sharp suits with federal marshal badges clipped to their belts. "Brianna Foster," one of the men asked, stepping fully into the glam room. His voice was loud, clear, and entirely devoid of sympathy. "Yes, but you need to leave right now," she stammered, her eyes darting nervously back to her phone screen, where the live chat was suddenly filling with question marks. "I am broadcasting live to 2 million people. My husband is a very powerful man, and he will have you arrested for breaking and entering." "Ma'am, I am a deputy United States Marshal," the man stated, holding up a thick stack of paperwork. "We have a federal warrant for the seizure of all assets purchased with funds connected to your husband's offshore accounts. Your husband, Connor Foster, was taken into federal custody 20 minutes ago on charges of wire fraud and money laundering." Brianna's face went completely slack. The color drained from her cheeks, leaving her looking like a wax figure under the harsh lights. The live chat on her screen had stopped moving entirely for 1 long second before it erupted into absolute chaos. 2 million people had just heard that her perfect Wall Street husband was a criminal. "That is a lie," she whispered, her hands trembling as she touched the diamond necklace. "Connor is at his office. He bought this for me today." "Yes, Mom," the marshal replied, stepping closer. "And according to the vendor receipts we seized from his email, that necklace was purchased yesterday using stolen corporate funds. I am going to need you to take it off right now. It is evidence of federal financial crimes and is subject to immediate forfeiture." "No," Brianna gasped, backing away from the camera. "You cannot take this. This is mine. Turn the camera off. Somebody turn the camera off." She lunged forward, knocking the ring light over. The camera tumbled to the floor, capturing a chaotic blur of the ceiling and the marshals moving in to secure the necklace. The audio captured her hysterical sobbing and the calm, firm voices of the federal agents instructing her to comply with the warrant. Then the feed abruptly cut to black. The live stream was over, but the internet is forever. Within seconds, the recording of the seizure was being reposted across every social media platform on the globe. The influencer had been unboxed. I closed the window on my computer and returned to my quarterly projections. I knew exactly what would happen next, and I only had to wait a few hours for the inevitable outcome. At 4:00 in the afternoon, the private elevator to my penthouse office chimed. I had instructed my lobby security to let her up. The heavy oak doors of my office swung open, and Brianna stumbled into the room. She was entirely unrecognizable from the glamorous woman who had been broadcasting that morning. Her designer clothes looked rumpled. Her perfectly styled hair was a messy knot. Dark streaks of mascara stained her cheeks where she had been crying for hours. She looked like a drowning victim who had just washed ashore. "Tara," she choked out, gripping the edge of the doorframe for support. I did not look up from my keyboard. "You look terrible, Brianna. You might want to fix your face before someone takes a photo of you. Your brand relies heavily on aesthetics." She let out a ragged sob and stumbled toward my desk. She slammed her hands down on the polished mahogany, her chest heaving as she struggled to catch her breath. "You did this!" she screamed, her voice hoarse and broken. "You set him up! Connor called me from a holding cell. He said you froze our accounts. He said you hacked his firm and gave fake documents to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. You ruined my life." I stopped typing and slowly looked up at her. "It is remarkable how confidently you speak about things you do not understand," I said, my voice perfectly calm, contrasting sharply with her hysteria. "I did not hack anything. Your husband is just incredibly stupid. He left a digital trail a mile wide because he thought he was smarter than everyone else. I simply gathered the receipts and handed them to the proper authorities." "You are lying," she shrieked, pointing a shaking finger at me. "You have always been jealous of me. You have always hated me because Mom and Dad loved me more. You are just a bitter, lonely woman who cannot stand to see anyone else happy. You ruined my marriage because you could never get a man of your own." I leaned back in my chair, observing her meltdown with clinical detachment. "Half of my sponsors have already dropped me," she cried, pacing back and forth in front of my desk, pulling at her hair. "Cosmetics companies, clothing brands. They are all terminating my contracts. They saw the video, Tara. 2 million people watched federal agents take my jewelry off my neck. My brand is completely dead. We do not have a single dollar to our names. Connor says they are going to take the house. Where am I supposed to live?" "You can always move back in with Mom and Dad," I suggested mildly. "Oh wait, they are currently facing foreclosure too. That might be a tight squeeze." Brianna stopped pacing and stared at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and rage. She marched back to the desk, leaning over it to glare at me. "You are a monster," she hissed. "You are doing all of this because you are jealous. You are doing this because Dad bought me my first house in Buckhead and threw you out on the street to fend for yourself. You have spent your whole life holding a grudge because I got the life you wanted." I let her words hang in the silent office. I looked at her red-rimmed eyes and her trembling hands, and I felt a profound sense of pity for how ignorant she truly was. She had lived her entire life in a padded room, shielded from the ugly reality of how our family actually operated. I stood up from my chair, drawing myself up to my full height. I walked around the desk until I was standing mere inches from her. She shrank back, slightly intimidated by the cold proximity. "You think Dad bought you that house because he loves you?" I asked, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "You think you earned that pristine little life in Buckhead because you were the good daughter?" "Yes," she stammered, lifting her chin defensively. "Because I did what I was told and I made the family look good." I shook my head slowly, a bitter smile touching my lips. "Dad bought that house in cash, Brianna. $2.5 million transferred directly from the corporate accounts of Caldwell Logistics to the real estate broker. Do you know where that specific $2.5 million came from?" She stared at me, silent and confused. "It came from the severance fund," I told her, articulating every word so she could not possibly misunderstand. 7 years ago, Dad automated the main sorting facility. He laid off 200 black men who had worked as truck drivers and warehouse managers for decades, men who had built his company with their bare hands. He fired them 2 weeks before their pensions and severance packages were fully vested. He used a legal loophole to deny them their payouts, leaving 200 families struggling to pay rent and feed their children. He took their money, and he bought your house with it. Brianna shook her head, stepping backward. No, that is not true. Dad is a respected businessman. He provides jobs for the community. He is a parasite, I corrected sharply. And you are living in a subsidized lie. Your entire existence, your designer clothes, your luxury cars, your expensive vacations, they are all funded by the exploitation of people who actually work for a living. You sit on the internet all day pretending to be a self-made queen while wearing jewelry bought with stolen money. Connor did not ruin your brand, Brianna. You never had a brand. You were just a pretty mannequin displaying stolen goods. Tears spilled over her eyelashes, ruining the last of her makeup. She covered her ears, shaking her head back and forth, as if she could physically block out the words. "Stop it," she cried. "Just stop it. I do not want to hear this." "Of course you do not," I said, walking back around my desk and taking my seat. "You never want to hear the truth because the truth requires accountability. You want to play the victim, but there are no victims in that house, only accomplices." "What am I supposed to do?" she whispered, looking completely broken. "I have nothing left." I looked at my computer screen, dismissing her entirely. "You should probably go find a good divorce lawyer," I suggested, returning my hands to the keyboard. "Though you might have to look for one who works pro bono since all your assets are frozen. Security will show you out." Brianna stood there for another long moment, waiting for me to offer some shred of sympathy or a lifeline. When she realized I was completely ignoring her, she finally turned and walked toward the heavy oak doors. Her shoulders were slumped, her previously flawless posture completely destroyed. She looked exactly like what she was, a hollow shell of a woman waking up to the reality of the real world. As the doors closed behind her, leaving me alone in the quiet sanctuary of my office, my cell phone buzzed. It was an urgent notification bypassing my usual filters. I picked up the phone. It was an automated email sent to all primary debt holders and executive board members of Caldwell Logistics. The subject line was flagged with red priority markers. Elijah Caldwell had just sent out an emergency summons for a mandatory board of directors meeting at the company headquarters tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. The email stated the meeting was regarding an urgent corporate restructuring and critical financial disclosures. I read the email twice, a slow, genuine smile spreading across my face. My father was backed into a corner. He knew the IRS was at his door, and he knew the bank was foreclosing. He was calling the board together to try and spin a web of lies, to beg for a bailout, or to sacrifice someone else to save his own skin. He thought he still had control of the narrative. He thought he could walk into his boardroom and command the room just like he always did. He had no idea that I held all the cards, and tomorrow morning I was going to walk into his sacred boardroom and strip away the very last thing he cared about. The empire was falling, and I was going to be the one to sign the demolition order. The glass and steel facade of the Caldwell Logistics headquarters stood exactly as I remembered it, a towering monument to my father's inflated ego rising above the Atlanta skyline. As my chauffeured Maybach pulled smoothly up to the front plaza, the morning sun reflected blindingly off the polished architecture. For 32 years, this building had represented everything I was excluded from. It was the physical manifestation of Elijah's doctrine of black excellence, a fortress where he reigned supreme, and where my brother Andre was paraded around as the heir apparent while I was dismissed as a tedious disappointment. I stepped out of the vehicle, the humid southern air wrapping around me, but I felt absolutely nothing but ice-cold clarity. I was not alone today. Flanking me in perfect synchronization was a team of 5 ruthless corporate attorneys from one of the most feared financial restructuring firms on the East Coast. We moved forward as a single wedge of tailored wool and lethal intention, cutting through the morning foot traffic. The lobby of Caldwell Logistics was a shrine to my father. Massive oil portraits of Elijah shaking hands with local politicians and holding novelty oversized checks adorn the marble walls. The receptionist, a young woman I did not recognize, stood up from behind her curved desk as we entered, her mouth opening to ask for our appointments. The sheer velocity and heavy silence of our approach made the words die in her throat. We bypassed the guest seating and marched directly toward the private executive security turnstiles. Marcus, the head of building security, and a man who had loyally guarded my father's secrets for 15 years, stepped forward to intercept us, his hand resting instinctively on his utility belt. I did not break my stride. I simply handed him a single thick sheet of premium paper bearing a federal injunction, the signature of a superior court judge, and the official embossed seal of my venture capital holding company. Marcus read the document, his eyes scanning the dense legal text. I watched the color drain from his face as he realized what he was holding. He looked at me, then looked at the document again. Without saying a single word, Marcus swiped his master keycard against the scanner, granting us immediate access to the private executive elevator. The ride to the top floor was suffocatingly silent. I watched the digital floor numbers tick upward, listening to the steady, rhythmic thrum of the elevator car. I remembered being a little girl riding this exact elevator, hoping my father would look down and smile at me, hoping he would show me the empire he had built. He never did. He only brought Andre to the boardroom. Today I was bringing the entire structure down to the bedrock. When the doors slid open, we stepped out onto the plush, custom-woven carpet of the executive suite. Through the frosted glass walls of the main boardroom, I could see the blurry silhouettes of the executive board members already gathered. They had convened an emergency session just as I knew they would. My father was standing at the head of the massive mahogany table. Even through the thick glass, I could see him gesturing expansively, trying to project his usual aura of absolute strength and unshakable control. Beside him, my brother Andre was slouched in his leather ergonomic chair, violently wiping his forehead with a crumpled silk handkerchief, looking exactly like a man walking toward the gallows. I reached out and pushed both of the heavy oak doors open at the exact same moment. The heavy thud of the solid wood hitting the brass wall stoppers echoed like a gunshot in the cavernous room, cutting my father's booming preacher voice off mid-sentence. 14 faces turned to stare at me in absolute paralyzed shock. The room smelled of expensive dark roast coffee, imported leather, and stale nervous sweat. My father froze, his hands suspended in the air. He was wearing his signature custom-tailored power suit, but the expensive fabric could not hide the sudden violent tremor in his broad shoulders. For a split second, the room was completely silent, save for the low hum of the central air conditioning. Then Elijah's face contorted into a mask of pure aristocratic rage, the same face he wore when he humiliated me at the barbecue. "What is the meaning of this?" he roared, his voice echoing off the acoustic ceiling panels. "Tara, how dare you interrupt a closed executive session? Who let you up here?" He slammed his heavy hand down on the table, glaring at the silent attorneys standing stoically behind me. "I want these people out of my building immediately. Marcus," he bellowed, reaching for the intercom button on his desk. "Bring security to the boardroom right now. We have trespassers." I walked slowly into the room, the clicking of my heels deliberate and unhurried, echoing against the tension in the air. I did not stop until I reached the opposite end of the long table, facing him directly down the center. I reached into my oversized leather tote bag and pulled out a massive 500-page bound dossier. I lifted it high enough for every single corrupt executive in the room to see the federal seals stamped on the cover before letting it drop flat onto the polished mahogany. The sound was deafening, a heavy final thud that made several board members physically jump in their seats. "Security works for me now, Dad," I said, my voice carrying clearly and calmly across the expanse of the table. "I hold 80% of Caldwell Logistics' toxic debt. By the corporate bylaws you wrote yourself, the primary creditor has the right to seize the board in the event of a catastrophic financial default." I pointed a single manicured finger toward the door. "Get out of my chair." The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush a man. My father's jaw dropped, his eyes darting frantically from the massive dossier to the faces of his board members, looking for someone, anyone to jump to his defense to tell me I was wrong. Nobody moved. They were all staring at the document on the table, recognizing it as the irrefutable proof of their collective doom. The illusion of his omnipotence vanished in the span of 3 heartbeats. Then Andre finally snapped. The golden boy, the supposed business prodigy who spent more time on the golf course than looking at balance sheets, pushed his chair back so violently it tipped over and crashed onto the floor. He lunged around the side of the table, his face blotchy red and sweating profusely, pointing a thick, shaking finger directly at my face. "You arrogant little witch," he spat, taking heavy, aggressive steps toward me, trying to physically intimidate me, just like he used to do when we were teenagers in the hallways of our childhood home. "You think you can just walk in here and steal our company? I am the vice president. I am the future of this family legacy. I will throw you out that window myself." He did not even make it within 5 feet of me. Marcus, the head of security, had followed us up the elevator and was standing quietly just inside the doorway. As Andre lunged forward, Marcus stepped smoothly and efficiently into his path, pressing a heavy muscular hand firmly against Andre's chest, stopping my brother dead in his tracks. "Sit down," Andre Marcus said, his voice low, but carrying an undeniable physical threat. "You heard the lady. She owns the building now." Andre stared at Marcus in complete disbelief, betrayal washing over his sweaty face. The reality that the staff no longer answered to the Caldwell men broke something in his mind. He stumbled backward, his knees hitting the edge of an empty chair, and he sank into it, looking completely winded. I turned my attention away from my pathetic brother and focused on the rest of the room. The men and women sitting at this table had enabled my father for decades. They had rubber-stamped his fraudulent expansion loans, they had ignored the missing pension funds, and they had collected their exorbitant year-end bonuses while the warehouse workers struggled to pay rent and feed their families. Gentlemen and ladies, I began pacing slowly down the length of the table, my attorneys remaining perfectly still by the doors. As of this exact moment, this executive board is permanently dissolved. You are all officially terminated, effective immediately. Please leave your company keycards and any corporate devices on the table before you exit. The chief financial officer, a gray-haired man named Harrison, who had known me since I was in braces, opened his mouth to protest. "Tara, you cannot be serious," he stammered, adjusting his expensive glasses nervously with shaking hands. "We have guaranteed severance packages. We have ironclad employment contracts. You cannot simply wipe us out." "You will get absolutely nothing, Harrison." I cut him off sharply, my voice slicing through his pathetic defense. "Your direct signatures are on the digital wire transfers that moved $15 million of company money into Connor Foster's offshore hedge fund. I have already handed the entire unredacted paper trail over to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. You should not be sitting here worrying about your golden parachute severance packages. You should be rushing home to hire the best criminal defense attorneys you can find before the marshals show up at your front doors." A collective gasp echoed through the room. A few of the executives actually stood up, grabbing their briefcases and rushing toward the door without another word, realizing the ship was not just sinking, it was already at the bottom of the ocean. I reached the head of the table. My father had not moved an inch. He was staring at me, his eyes wide and hollow, stripped of all the fake Southern charm and predatory confidence he relied on. The booming preacher, the arrogant patriarch, the man who had humiliated me in front of hundreds of people just 48 hours ago was completely gone. In his place was a terrified, fragile old man, realizing that his entire legacy was built on quicksand, and the tide had just rushed in to wash it all away. I did not scream at him. I did not demand an apology for the decades of emotional abuse. The absolute quiet stripping of his power in front of his peers was far more devastating than any emotional outburst could ever be. I looked down at him and gestured to the open doorway. "I will not ask you again, Elijah," I said deliberately, stripping away the title of father and using his first name. Vacate the premises before I have Marcus escort you out of the lobby in handcuffs in front of your remaining employees." My father slowly reached for his leather briefcase, his hands shaking so violently he could barely grasp the handle. He looked completely defeated, his shoulders slumped under the weight of his total ruin. But as he turned to walk away, the fragile illusion of their family loyalty finally snapped entirely. Andre, realizing that he was the one who had actually executed the fraudulent wire transfers, realizing that his brother-in-law, Connor, was likely already in federal custody, and that he was staring down the barrel of a decade in a federal penitentiary, completely lost his mind. He scrambled to his feet, his chest heaving with sheer panic, his custom suit wrinkled and stained with sweat. He pointed a shaking, terrified finger directly at our father's chest, his voice cracking with pure, raw desperation. "Do not you dare walk out of here and leave me to take the fall for this!" he screamed, the sound tearing through the quiet boardroom. "Tell her the truth, Dad. Tell her you ordered me to do it." The echo of Andre's voice hung in the massive room like a physical weight. I sat back in the heavy leather executive chair that had belonged to my father for 30 years and watched the magnificent implosion of the golden child. Andre was completely unraveling right in front of my eyes. The perfectly groomed vice president of Caldwell Logistics was gone. In his place stood a terrified, sweating little boy who had just realized that his father's protection could not save him from federal prison. Elijah stared at his only son, his face a rigid mask of absolute disgust. He did not move to comfort him. He did not offer reassurance. Instead, my father straightened his posture, smoothing the lapels of his custom suit, as if trying to physically brush off the shame of Andre's panic. "Keep your mouth shut, boy," Elijah hissed, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that used to send me running for my bedroom when I was a child. "You are embarrassing yourself, and you are embarrassing this family. Get control of your emotions before you say something you cannot take back." But Andre was far beyond the reach of our father's intimidation tactics. He ripped the expensive silk tie from his neck and threw it onto the polished mahogany table. He began pacing back and forth, his chest heaving, his eyes wild and bloodshot. "I am not keeping my mouth shut anymore, Dad," Andre yelled, his voice cracking with hysteria. "I am not going down for this. You think I am going to let them lock me in a federal penitentiary so you and Mom can keep pretending we are Atlanta royalty? You forced me to do this. You made me sign those papers." He turned to me, pointing a shaking finger at my father. "Tara, you have to believe me." He pleaded, tears actually spilling over his eyelashes and streaming down his cheeks. I did not want any part of this. I told him the margins were impossible. I told him we could not afford the new warehouse expansion, or the country club fees, or Mom's weekly shopping sprees. But he would not listen. He just kept screaming about Black excellence. He kept telling me that we had to project wealth so the white board members would respect us. He said if we looked broke, they would swallow us whole. Elijah slammed his fist onto the table, a thunderous sound that made the remaining lawyers flinch. "I built this empire with my bare hands, you ungrateful coward," he roared, the veins bulging in his thick neck. "I pulled this family out of the dirt so you could go to private schools and drive luxury cars. I gave you the keys to a kingdom, and you were too weak to hold on to it. You were supposed to be my legacy." "Your legacy is a fraud, Dad," Andre sobbed, openly weeping now. "You paraded me around society as your brilliant successor, but you never actually taught me how to run a company. You just wanted a handsome puppet to stand next to you in photos. You wanted a son who looked the part. And when the company started bleeding money, you did not want to sell assets because it would ruin your precious image. So you brought Connor in. You brought the smart white finance guy in to fix your mess because you thought his Wall Street pedigree would legitimize your failing logistics firm." My father looked like he had been physically struck. The truth was ugly, and it was spilling out onto the expensive carpet for everyone to see. The great Elijah Caldwell was nothing but a fragile narcissist who had leveraged his entire company just to keep up appearances for people who did not even care about him. He had sacrificed his own son's freedom on the altar of his ego. "You told me to follow Connor's instructions. Andre continued, his voice raw and ragged. You said Connor knew how to mitigate our tax burden. You knew exactly what those offshore accounts were for Dad. Do not stand there and pretend you did not know we were stealing from the employee pension fund to pay the mortgage on the Cascade estate. You authorized every single transfer. I sat motionless, absorbing every single word of their mutual destruction. For 32 years, they had made me feel like an outsider because I refused to participate in their grand theater of fake wealth. They had called me a disappointment because I chose to build actual sustainable wealth quietly in the shadows, while they loudly spent money they did not have. And now here they were turning on each other like starving animals in a cage. Before my father could formulate another defense, the heavy oak doors of the boardroom swung open once again. The sudden movement drew every eye in the room. Standing in the doorway was Connor Foster. He looked nothing like the smug, arrogant Wall Street predator who had threatened to destroy my life just a few hours ago. He had clearly just been released on bail, and the experience of federal holding had stripped him of his polished veneer. His expensive tailored shirt was wrinkled and stained with sweat. He was missing his suit jacket and his tie. His blonde hair was disheveled and his face was pale and drawn. But beneath the exhaustion in his eyes burned a cold, furious rage. He walked into the room, ignoring Marcus and the security team who tensed, ready to intervene. Connor bypassed me completely. His furious gaze locked squarely on my brother. I heard my name, you pathetic little coward. Connor sneered, his voice dripping with absolute contempt. Andre froze, his tears drying up instantly as he stared at his brother-in-law. Connor, how did you get out? Andre stammered. I posted a cash bond from an account you and your psychotic sister did not know about. Connor spat, glancing briefly at me with pure venom before returning his attention to Andre. And thank God I got here in time to hear you trying to blame this entire operation on me. You spineless, incompetent fool. I did not blame you, Connor, Andre said, stepping backward defensively. I told her Dad made us do it. I told her it was his idea to use your offshore channels. Connor let out a harsh, barking laugh that held no humor whatsoever. It was a cold, ugly sound that echoed in the tense boardroom. My channels, he mocked, taking another aggressive step toward my brother. You think you had any idea how to structure a corporate tax shelter? You think your dinosaur of a father had the intellectual capacity to build a Cayman holding company? I carried this incompetent family on my back for 4 years. I structured everything. I saved you from bankruptcy 3 separate times while you were busy playing golf and pretending to be a business prodigy. Elijah puffed out his chest, trying to summon his patriarchal authority. Now you listen here, Connor. You married my daughter. You were part of this family. We trusted your financial expertise, and you led my son astray. Connor turned his head slowly, looking at my father with an expression of such profound racial and class superiority that it actually made my stomach turn. The polite liberal ally mask that he had worn to family dinners and charity galas was completely gone. He was looking at my father as if he were an insect on the bottom of his expensive shoe. Do not you ever speak to me about trust, Elijah. Connor said, his voice low and vibrating with hate. I elevated this entire family the day I married Brianna. You people would be absolutely nothing without my financial guidance. You think you are Atlanta royalty. You are a glorified truck driver who got lucky with a regional contract. And your son here, Andre, could not even run a lemonade stand without my brains backing him up. The racial dynamics of the room suddenly shifted into sharp focus. Connor was no longer holding back. He was unleashing years of silent resentment and arrogant superiority. You think I wanted to launder money for you, Connor continued, his voice rising in volume. I did it because your vacuous daughter Brianna was spending $50,000 a month on clothes and vacations to play pretend on the internet. I did it because you, Elijah, were too busy buying influence at the country club to realize your margins were bleeding out. I took my cut because I deserved it. I was owed that money for having to deal with the sheer staggering incompetence of the Caldwell men. I brought my pedigree to your name. I gave you legitimacy. Andre let out a sound that was half sob and half roar. The realization that this white man who had eaten at our table, who had slept in our home, who had married his sister, actually despised them to their very core, finally pushed Andre over the edge of sanity. All the pressure, all the fear of prison, all the humiliation of being called a puppet exploded in a sudden violent rush of adrenaline. Andre lunged forward, closing the distance between them in two massive strides. He did not throw a proper punch. He simply tackled Connor using his heavier frame to drive the Wall Street broker backward. They crashed heavily into the side of the mahogany conference table. The impact sent crystal water pitchers and expensive ceramic coffee mugs shattering onto the floor. Connor let out a breathless grunt as Andre's weight crushed him against the edge of the wood, but he was quick to recover. He brought his knee up sharply, catching Andre in the ribs and sending them both toppling sideways onto the custom-woven carpet. It was not a dignified fight. It was a chaotic, pathetic brawl between two desperate, cowardly men who had lost everything. They rolled across the floor, tearing at each other's expensive shirts, grunting and cursing with every strike. Andre landed a sloppy, heavy punch to Connor's jaw, snapping his head back. Connor retaliated by grabbing a handful of Andre's shirt collar and slamming his fist into my brother's nose, causing a sudden spray of bright red blood to scatter across the carpet. Elijah shouted in a panic, stepping forward to try and separate them. "Stop it! Both of you stop it right now," he yelled, reaching down to grab Andre's shoulder. But in the chaos of the struggle, Connor threw a wild elbow that caught my father squarely in the chest. Elijah stumbled backward, his legs tangling in an overturned chair, and he collapsed onto the floor with a heavy, undignified thud, holding his ribs and gasping for air. The great patriarch of the Caldwell family, the man who demanded absolute respect and submission from everyone around him, was lying on the floor gasping while his golden son and his white savior beat each other bloody over the ruins of his stolen empire. Marcus and my security team stepped forward immediately, their hands reaching for their radios, but I raised a single finger, stopping them in their tracks. "Let them go," I commanded softly. I sat perfectly still in the high-backed leather chair, resting my chin on my steepled fingers, and watched the spectacle unfold. I felt absolutely no urge to stop them. They were destroying each other physically, just as they had destroyed the company financially, and they deserved to feel every single ounce of pain they were inflicting. I watched my brother cry out as Connor landed another punch. I watched Connor desperately try to protect his face as Andre pinned him down. They were bleeding, sweating, and panting, struggling on the floor like wild dogs. For 32 years, I had been forced to watch them perform their pristine, flawless roles. I had watched them wear their expensive suits and their fake smiles, while they quietly mocked my independence and my work ethic. I had sat through endless holiday dinners listening to them congratulate themselves on their brilliance. Now the curtain had fallen, and the true ugly reality of their partnership was exposed. They fought for another 2 minutes until pure physical exhaustion finally slowed them down. Andre rolled off Connor, clutching his bleeding nose and gasping for breath, his suit torn and completely ruined. Connor lay flat on his back, staring at the ceiling panel with a swollen eye and a split lip, his chest heaving violently. The room fell into a heavy, ragged silence, broken only by the sound of their desperate breathing and the quiet weeping of my father, who was still struggling to sit up against the overturned chair. I slowly leaned forward in my seat. I picked up the heavy silver fountain pen that rested on the leather blotting pad in front of me. I looked at the small directional microphone embedded in the center of the mahogany table. I tapped the pen against the metal grill of the microphone. Tap, tap, tap. The sharp, amplified sound cut through the heavy breathing and the pathetic groans of the men on the floor. Andre and Connor both flinched, looking up at me from the carpet with bloodshot, exhausted eyes. My father stopped weeping and stared at me from the floor, his face pale and terrified. I looked at the 3 men who had made my life a misery, who had stolen millions, and who were currently bleeding on my floor. I felt a cold, absolute power radiating through my veins. The trap had sprung completely, and there was no way out for any of them. "Are you two done?" I asked, my voice smooth and perfectly composed, carrying through the speakers and filling every corner of the shattered boardroom. They simply stared at me, too exhausted and broken to formulate a response. I smiled, setting the silver pen back down on the desk. Because you are both lying, I said, my gaze locking onto them with the cold precision of an executioner. And I have the receipts. I reached over and pressed a button on the control panel built into the desk. The massive flat-screen monitor on the wall behind me flickered to life. The Caldwell Logistics logo disappeared, replaced by a highly encrypted federal evidence portal. Let us look at the real numbers, I said, settling back into my chair. The final phase of your destruction begins right now. Gentlemen, welcome to my world. Let us see how well you survive it. The echo of Andre's voice hung in the massive room like a physical weight. I sat back in the heavy leather executive chair that had belonged to my father for 30 years and watched the magnificent implosion of the Golden Child. Andre was completely unraveling right in front of my eyes. The perfectly groomed vice president of Caldwell Logistics was gone. In his place stood a terrified, sweating little boy who had just realized that his father's protection could not save him from federal prison. Elijah stared at his only son, his face a rigid mask of absolute disgust. He did not move to comfort him. He did not offer reassurance. Instead, my father straightened his posture, smoothing the lapels of his custom suit, as if trying to physically brush off the shame of Andre's panic. "Keep your mouth shut, boy." Elijah hissed, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that used to send me running for my bedroom when I was a child. "You are embarrassing yourself, and you are embarrassing this family. Get control of your emotions before you say something you cannot take back." But Andre was far beyond the reach of our father's intimidation tactics. He ripped the expensive silk tie from his neck and threw it onto the polished mahogany table. He began pacing back and forth, his chest heaving, his eyes wild and bloodshot. "I am not keeping my mouth shut anymore, Dad," Andre yelled, his voice cracking with hysteria. "I am not going down for this. You think I am going to let them lock me in a federal penitentiary so you and Mom can keep pretending we are Atlanta royalty? You forced me to do this. You made me sign those papers." He turned to me, pointing a shaking finger at my father. "Tara, you have to believe me," he pleaded, tears actually spilling over his eyelashes and streaming down his cheeks. I did not want any part of this. I told him the margins were impossible. I told him we could not afford the new warehouse expansion or the country club fees or Mom's weekly shopping sprees. But he would not listen. He just kept screaming about Black excellence. He kept telling me that we had to project wealth so the white board members would respect us. He said if we looked broke, they would swallow us whole. Elijah slammed his fist onto the table, a thunderous sound that made the remaining lawyers flinch. "I built this empire with my bare hands, you ungrateful coward," he roared, the veins bulging in his thick neck. "I pulled this family out of the dirt so you could go to private schools and drive luxury cars. I gave you the keys to a kingdom, and you were too weak to hold on to it. You were supposed to be my legacy." "Your legacy is a fraud, Dad," Andre sobbed, openly weeping now. "You paraded me around society as your brilliant successor, but you never actually taught me how to run a company. You just wanted a handsome puppet to stand next to you in photos. You wanted a son who looked the part. And when the company started bleeding money, you did not want to sell assets because it would ruin your precious image. So you brought Connor in. You brought the smart white finance guy in to fix your mess because you thought his Wall Street pedigree would legitimize your failing logistics firm." My father looked like he had been physically struck. The truth was ugly, and it was spilling out onto the expensive carpet for everyone to see. The great Elijah Caldwell was nothing but a fragile narcissist who had leveraged his entire company just to keep up appearances for people who did not even care about him. He had sacrificed his own son's freedom on the altar of his ego. "You told me to follow Connor's instructions," Andre continued, his voice raw and ragged. "You said Connor knew how to mitigate our tax burden. You knew exactly what those offshore accounts were for Dad. Do not stand there and pretend you did not know we were stealing from the employee pension fund to pay the mortgage on the Cascade estate. You authorized every single transfer." I sat motionless, absorbing every single word of their mutual destruction. For 32 years, they had made me feel like an outsider because I refused to participate in their grand theater of fake wealth. They had called me a disappointment because I chose to build actual sustainable wealth quietly in the shadows, while they loudly spent money they did not have. And now here they were turning on each other like starving animals in a cage. Before my father could formulate another defense, the heavy oak doors of the boardroom swung open once again. The sudden movement drew every eye in the room. Standing in the doorway was Connor Foster. He looked nothing like the smug, arrogant Wall Street predator who had threatened to destroy my life just a few hours ago. He had clearly just been released on bail, and the experience of federal holding had stripped him of his polished veneer. His expensive tailored shirt was wrinkled and stained with sweat. He was missing his suit jacket and his tie. His blonde hair was disheveled, and his face was pale and drawn. But beneath the exhaustion in his eyes burned a cold, furious rage. He walked into the room, ignoring Marcus and the security team who tensed ready to intervene. Connor bypassed me completely. His furious gaze locked squarely on my brother. "I heard my name, you pathetic little coward?" Connor sneered, his voice dripping with absolute contempt. Andre froze his tears, drying up instantly as he stared at his brother-in-law. "Connor, how did you get out?" Andre stammered. "I posted a cash bond from an account you and your psychotic sister did not know about." Connor spat, glancing briefly at me with pure venom, before returning his attention to Andre. "And thank God I got here in time to hear you trying to blame this entire operation on me." "You spineless, incompetent fool! I did not blame you, Connor," Andre said, stepping backward defensively. "I told her Dad made us do it. I told her it was his idea to use your offshore channels." Connor let out a harsh barking laugh that held no humor whatsoever. It was a cold, ugly sound that echoed in the tense boardroom. "My channels," he mocked, taking another aggressive step toward my brother. "You think you had any idea how to structure a corporate tax shelter? You think your dinosaur of a father had the intellectual capacity to build a Cayman holding company? I carried this incompetent family on my back for 4 years. I structured everything. I saved you from bankruptcy 3 separate times while you were busy playing golf and pretending to be a business prodigy." Elijah puffed out his chest, trying to summon his patriarchal authority. "Now you listen here, Connor. You married my daughter. You were part of this family. We trusted your financial expertise, and you led my son astray." Connor turned his head slowly, looking at my father with an expression of such profound racial and class superiority that it actually made my stomach turn. The polite liberal ally mask that he had worn to family dinners and charity galas was completely gone. He was looking at my father as if he were an insect on the bottom of his expensive shoe. "Do not you ever speak to me about trust, Elijah." Connor said, his voice low and vibrating with hate. "I elevated this entire family the day I married Brianna. You people would be absolutely nothing without my financial guidance. You think you are Atlanta royalty. You are a glorified truck driver who got lucky with a regional contract. And your son here, Andre, could not even run a lemonade stand without my brains backing him up." The racial dynamics of the room suddenly shifted into sharp focus. Connor was no longer holding back. He was unleashing years of silent resentment and arrogant superiority. "You think I wanted to launder money for you?" Connor continued, his voice rising in volume. "I did it because your vacuous daughter, Brianna, was spending $50,000 a month on clothes and vacations to play pretend on the internet. I did it because you, Elijah, were too busy buying influence at the country club to realize your margins were bleeding out. I took my cut because I deserved it. I was owed that money for having to deal with the sheer, staggering incompetence of the Caldwell men. I brought my pedigree to your name. I gave you legitimacy." Andre let out a sound that was half sob and half roar. The realization that this white man who had eaten at our table, who had slept in our home, who had married his sister, actually despised them. To their very core, finally pushed Andre over the edge of sanity. All the pressure, all the fear of prison, all the humiliation of being called a puppet exploded in a sudden violent rush of adrenaline. Andre lunged forward, closing the distance between them in 2 massive strides. He did not throw a proper punch. He simply tackled Connor, using his heavier frame to drive the Wall Street broker backward. They crashed heavily into the side of the mahogany conference table. The impact sent crystal water pitchers and expensive ceramic coffee mugs shattering onto the floor. Connor let out a breathless grunt as Andres' weight crushed him against the edge of the wood, but he was quick to recover. He brought his knee up sharply, catching Andre in the ribs and sending them both toppling sideways onto the custom-woven carpet. It was not a dignified fight. It was a chaotic, pathetic brawl between two desperate, cowardly men who had lost everything. They rolled across the floor, tearing at each other's expensive shirts, grunting and cursing with every strike. Andre landed a sloppy, heavy punch to Connor's jaw, snapping his head back. Connor retaliated by grabbing a handful of Andre's shirt collar and slamming his fist into my brother's nose, causing a sudden spray of bright red blood to scatter across the carpet. Elijah shouted in a panic, stepping forward to try and separate them. "Stop it, both of you! Stop it right now!" he yelled, reaching down to grab Andre's shoulder. But in the chaos of the struggle, Connor threw a wild elbow that caught my father squarely in the chest. Elijah stumbled backward, his legs tangling in an overturned chair, and he collapsed onto the floor with a heavy, undignified thud holding his ribs and gasping for air. The great patriarch of the Caldwell family, the man who demanded absolute respect and submission from everyone around him, was lying on the floor gasping, while his golden son and his white savior beat each other bloody over the ruins of his stolen empire. Marcus and my security team stepped forward immediately, their hands reaching for their radios, but I raised a single finger, stopping them in their tracks. "Let them go," I commanded softly. I sat perfectly still in the high-back leather chair, resting my chin on my steepled fingers, and watched the spectacle unfold. I felt absolutely no urge to stop them. They were destroying each other physically, just as they had destroyed the company financially, and they deserved to feel every single ounce of pain they were inflicting. I watched my brother cry out as Connor landed another punch. I watched Connor desperately try to protect his face as Andre pinned him down. They were bleeding, sweating and panting, struggling on the floor like wild dogs. For 32 years, I had been forced to watch them perform their pristine, flawless roles. I had watched them wear their expensive suits and their fake smiles while they quietly mocked my independence and my work ethic. I had sat through endless holiday dinners, listening to them congratulate themselves on their brilliance. Now the curtain had fallen, and the true ugly reality of their partnership was exposed. They fought for another 2 minutes until pure physical exhaustion finally slowed them down. Andre rolled off Connor, clutching his bleeding nose and gasping for breath, his suit torn and completely ruined. Connor lay flat on his back, staring at the ceiling panel with a swollen eye and a split lip, his chest heaving violently. The room fell into a heavy, ragged silence, broken only by the sound of their desperate breathing and the quiet weeping of my father, who was still struggling to sit up against the overturned chair. I slowly leaned forward in my seat. I picked up my cell phone from the smooth mahogany table. The room was so quiet you could hear the digital chime as I swiped across the screen. I did not need to raise my voice. I had complete control of the room. I tapped a few buttons, accessing the integrated Bluetooth sound system that my father had installed in the boardroom for his grand presentations. The soft chime of the connection echoed from the speakers hidden in the ceiling panels above us. Every eye in the room tracked my movements. They were like terrified hostages waiting to see what the executioner would do next. "Are you two done?" I asked, my voice smooth and perfectly composed, carrying through the speakers and filling every corner of the shattered boardroom. They simply stared at me, too exhausted and broken to formulate a response. "Because you are both lying," I said, my gaze locking onto them with the cold precision of an executioner. "And I have the receipts." I pressed play on my phone screen. The high-definition audio filled the boardroom. It was crisp and clear. The background noise of clinking crystal glasses and soft jazz music was immediately recognizable. It was the exclusive dining room of the Cascade Country Club. The recording was exactly 3 years old. I had acquired it when I first initiated my hostile takeover research, hiring private investigators to shadow the men who were draining this company dry. Connor's voice came through the speakers, first smooth and full of aristocratic arrogance. "Elijah is an arrogant fool," Connor said on the recording, the disdain echoing off the boardroom walls. "He is so desperate to be accepted by the old money crowd that he cannot even see straight." We just slip the offshore transfer documents in with the monthly payroll sheets. He signs everything without reading it. He just likes the feeling of holding the pen. I watched my father's face as he heard the voice of the white son-in-law he had practically worshipped. Elijah's eyes widened, and his hand drifted up to grip his chest. The man he had brought in to elevate the family name was mocking him with effortless cruelty, treating him like a senile mark in a long con. But the worst was yet to come. Andre's voice came through the speakers next, lacking any of the bravado he usually displayed around our father. "I do not care what the old man thinks he is doing," Andre said on the recording, the sound of ice clinking in his glass, masking his cowardice. "As long as I get my $2 million cut every single year, let the old man take the fall if the Internal Revenue Service ever comes knocking. He built this company, let him go down with the ship. I am not going to let his ego drag my lifestyle down." I paused the recording. The silence that slammed back into the boardroom was deafening. The air felt incredibly heavy. Andre and Connor were frozen on the floor. They could not fight. They could not argue. Their own words, spoken in the safety of their exclusive country club, had just condemned them to federal prison. They had explicitly engineered the ruin of Caldwell Logistics, and they had purposefully designed the fraud so that Elijah would be the one holding the smoking gun when the feds finally arrived. My father looked like a man who had just been gutted alive. The sheer magnitude of the betrayal paralyzed him. His beloved son and his prestigious son-in-law had colluded to destroy his life. He pushed himself off the overturned chair, his knees trembling so violently they could barely support his weight. He did not look at Andre. He did not look at Connor. He looked entirely at me. For the first time in 32 years, he really looked at me. The arrogance was gone. The patriarchal authority was completely shattered. He stumbled forward, his legs giving out beneath him, and he fell to the floor, landing heavily on the custom carpet right in front of where I sat. The great Elijah Caldwell was on his hands and knees. He looked up at me, tears cutting tracks through the lines on his aging face. "Tara, please," he begged, his voice breaking into a pathetic sob. "Please, you have to stop this. You are my brilliant daughter. I see that now. I was wrong. I was so wrong about you. You are the only one who actually understands business. You have those ruthless corporate lawyers. You have the holding company. You can fix this. You can explain to the feds that I did not know. You can use your resources to keep me out of jail." He reached out a trembling hand toward my shoes, but he did not dare touch me. "Please, Tara," he wept, the sound pathetic and small in the massive room. "I am your father. I am an old man. I will not survive in a federal prison. They set me up. You heard the recording. You know I am innocent. Save me, Tara. I will give you whatever you want. I will hand over the entire company to you right now." I looked down at the weeping man at my feet. For a fraction of a second, I remembered being a little girl, wanting nothing more than for this man to tell me he was proud of me. I remembered standing in the driveway watching him teach Andre how to throw a football while ignoring my straight-A report card. I remembered the sheer humiliation of standing at the Father's Day barbecue while he announced to the entire elite society of Atlanta that I was a profound disappointment. I felt absolutely nothing. No pity, no remorse, no hesitation. I stood up from the executive chair, stepping to the side and putting a foot of distance between my pristine heels and his trembling hands. I stepped over his outstretched arm with complete detachment. "You are not innocent, Dad," I said, my voice cold and hard as a diamond. "You are just ignorant. You signed those offshore transfer documents because you were blinded by greed and ego. You loved the feeling of holding the pen. You loved the feeling of being the king. You let Connor and Andre launder $15 million because you were too arrogant to ever admit that you did not actually understand the complex financial instruments they were putting in front of you." I looked down at his broken, weeping form, making sure he heard every single syllable of his ultimate defeat. "You sacrificed me to fund them," I continued, my voice slicing through his pathetic sobbing. "You stole the pension funds of 200 loyal workers to fund them. You sacrificed everything just to fund the illusion of your excellence. I do not want your company, Dad. I already own it. I bought your entire kingdom for pennies because you ran it into the ground trying to impress people who are currently laughing at you. Elijah let out a broken, wailing cry, burying his face in his hands. He curled into a tight ball on the floor, mourning the absolute death of his legacy. Outside the thick, insulated glass of the high-rise windows, a new sound began to penetrate the boardroom. It was faint at first, but it grew louder and more insistent with every passing second. The high-pitched wail of multiple sirens echoed through the downtown Atlanta streets, bouncing off the skyscrapers and rising toward the penthouse level. The red and blue flashing lights cast a faint rhythmic glow against the glass walls of the executive suite. My father looked up toward the windows, his eyes wide with absolute terror. Andre let out a whimpering sound, burying his bleeding face in his hands. Connor just closed his eyes, his head dropping back against the carpet. I adjusted the strap of my oversized leather tote bag and smoothed the front of my tailored blazer. My attorneys parted to let me through, falling into step behind me in perfect synchronization. "The feds are waiting in the lobby," I said, my voice perfectly calm, cutting through the wailing sirens. I walked out of the room, leaving the doors wide open. The war was over, and the ashes of their empire belonged entirely to me. The morning sun was a bleeding wound over the Atlanta skyline as my private chauffeured vehicle pulled up to the towering glass and steel facade of the Caldwell Logistics headquarters. For my entire 32 years of life, this massive building had stood as a suffocating monument to my father's inflated ego. It was the physical manifestation of his grand illusion. He had built this logistics empire on the broken backs of hardworking people and paraded it around the elite social circles of the city as a pristine beacon of black excellence while secretly rotting it from the inside out with his own greed. Today, the absolute rot was finally going to be dragged out into the blinding sunlight. I stepped out of the heavy luxury vehicle, the thick, humid southern air washing over my face, but I felt absolutely nothing but freezing, crystalline clarity. I was not walking into this fortress alone. Flanking me in perfect aggressive synchronization was a specialized team of 5 ruthless corporate attorneys I had flown in directly from a highly feared financial restructuring firm in Manhattan. They were the absolute apex predators of the corporate world, men and women who dismantled billion-dollar companies before their morning coffee. We moved across the polished concrete plaza as a single, unstoppable wedge of tailored wool and lethal intention cutting effortlessly through the morning foot traffic. The massive main lobby of the headquarters was a literal shrine to Elijah Caldwell. Giant oil paintings of my father shaking hands with local politicians and holding novelty oversized charity checks adorned the imported marble walls. I had always deeply hated this lobby. It was a space specifically designed by architects to make anyone who entered feel small and entirely insignificant before they ever reached the executive floors. The head receptionist, a young woman who looked completely terrified, stood up from behind her curved mahogany desk as our formidable group approached. She opened her mouth to ask for our appointments, but the sheer velocity and heavy silence of our approach made the words die instantly in her throat. We bypassed the guest registration seating completely and marched directly toward the private executive security turnstiles. Marcus, the massive head of building security, and a man who had loyally guarded my father's physical safety and corporate secrets for 15 years, stepped forward to intercept us. His hand rested instinctively on his heavy utility belt. I did not slow my pace or break my stride for even a fraction of a second. I simply reached out and handed him a single thick sheet of premium legal paper, bearing a federal injunction, the signature of a superior court judge, and the official embossed seal of my venture capital holding company. Marcus stopped and read the document, his eyes scanning the dense, aggressive legal text. I watched the color completely drain from his weathered face as he realized exactly what he was holding. He looked at me, and then he looked down at the federal document again. Without saying a single word or asking a single question, Marcus slowly swiped his master override keycard against the optical scanner, granting us immediate access to the private executive elevator bank. He then stepped silently onto the elevator behind us. His loyalty instantly and permanently transferred to the person who actually held the true power in the building. The ride up to the top floor was suffocatingly silent. I watched the digital floor numbers tick steadily upward, listening to the quiet, rhythmic thrum of the elevator machinery, pulling us toward the penthouse suite. I distinctly remembered being a little girl standing in this exact elevator, hoping my father would look down and smile at me, hoping he would show me the empire he had built from nothing. He never did. He only ever brought Andre up to the boardroom. Andre was the golden son, the flawless heir apparent, the one destined to inherit the kingdom, while I was routinely cast aside and dismissed as a tedious, bitter disappointment. Today, I was bringing the entire corrupt structure down to the bedrock and setting the rubble on fire. When the polished steel doors slid open, we stepped out onto the plush, custom-woven carpet of the executive suite. Through the thick frosted glass walls of the main boardroom, I could see the blurry, silhouetted figures of the executive board members already gathered around the table. They had convened a mandatory emergency session at 9 o'clock, exactly as Elijah had ordered in his panicked email the afternoon before. I signaled for my attorneys to wait just outside the glass doors for a moment. I wanted to hear exactly what kind of desperate, fabricated lies my father was spinning to his loyal enablers before I ended his career. I moved closer to the heavy glass door, listening intently. Inside, my father was standing at the head of the massive, custom-built mahogany table. His voice boomed through the room, dripping with the fake Southern charm and aggressive preacher cadence he always used to manipulate people into doing his bidding. He was wearing his signature custom-tailored power suit, actively trying to project his usual aura of absolute strength and unshakable control. He was telling the board members that the company was merely facing a temporary minor cash flow issue due to aggressive regional expansion. He was proposing an immediate corporate restructuring vote to quietly hide the missing millions, framing the massive fraud as a brilliant strategic pivot to optimize long-term shareholder value. Beside him, my brother Andre was slouched deep in his leather ergonomic chair, violently wiping his forehead with a crumpled silk handkerchief. Andre looked exactly like a man taking his final steps toward the gallows. He was sweating profusely through his designer shirt, his eyes darting nervously around the room, while our father lied through his teeth to the entire board. Andre knew the IRS was currently closing in on their accounts. He knew the money was completely gone, and he knew that he was the one who had actually signed the fraudulent offshore wire transfers, because our father always made sure to keep his own hands technically clean of the actual crimes. I had heard more than enough of the pathetic theater. I reached out and pushed both of the heavy oak doors open at the exact same moment. The heavy thud of the solid wood hitting the brass wall stoppers echoed like a literal gunshot in the cavernous room, cutting my father's booming voice off mid-sentence. 14 faces turned to stare at me in absolute paralyzed shock. The room smelled of expensive dark roast coffee, imported leather, and stale nervous sweat. My father froze completely, his hands suspended in the air. For a split second, the room was completely silent, save for the low hum of the central air conditioning unit. Then Elijah's face contorted into a mask of pure aristocratic rage, the exact same hateful face he wore when he threw me out of his house years ago. "What is the meaning of this?" he roared, his voice echoing aggressively off the acoustic ceiling panels. "Tara, how dare you interrupt a closed executive session? Who let you up here?" He slammed his heavy hand down on the table, glaring at the silent tailored attorneys, who had now stepped into the room, forming a wall behind me. "I want these people out of my building immediately." "Marcus," he bellowed, looking at the security chief standing quietly by the open door. "Throw them out. Drag her out of this building right now." I walked slowly into the room, the sharp clicking of my heels, deliberate and unhurried, echoing against the heavy tension in the air. I did not stop until I reached the opposite end of the long table, facing him directly down the center. I reached into my oversized leather tote bag and pulled out a massive 500-page bound dossier. I lifted it high enough for every single corrupt executive in the room to see the federal seals stamped on the thick cover before letting it drop flat onto the polished mahogany. The sound was deafening, a heavy final thud that made several older board members physically jump in their seats. "Security works for me now, Dad," I said, my voice carrying clearly and calmly across the expanse of the table, cutting through his fading authority. My father stared at me, his jaw clenching as he tried to process my impossible words. "What kind of insane delusion are you suffering from?" He spat, gripping the edges of the table until his knuckles turned white. "You have no authority here. You are nothing in this company. I hold 80% of Caldwell Logistics' toxic debt." I stated, slowly articulating every single word so the absolute reality could sink into his stubborn, arrogant mind. "For the past 6 months, I have been quietly buying up every single defaulted loan, every leveraged physical asset, and every unpaid corporate bond this company has issued. I bought them through anonymous shell companies and proxy venture capital firms, so you would never see me coming. You spent the last 5 years bleeding your own company dry to fund Brianna's designer clothes and Andre's luxury cars and your own pathetic country club memberships. You leveraged this entire building just to maintain the fragile illusion of your wealth. And I bought all of it out from under you." The silence in the boardroom was absolute and terrifying. The board members were staring at me, their mouths hanging open in sheer disbelief. They looked at the massive dossier on the table and then looked at my father, realizing that his grand restructuring plan was nothing but a desperate, pathetic lie to cover his tracks. "By the corporate bylaws you wrote yourself." I continued, pacing slowly down the side of the table, my eyes locked on his pale face. "The primary creditor has the right to seize the board in the event of a catastrophic financial default. You defaulted on 3 major commercial loans yesterday afternoon. I own the debt. I own the assets. I own this building." I pointed a single manicured finger directly at his chest. "Get out of my chair." My father's face went completely slack. The vibrant color drained entirely from his cheeks, leaving him looking like a hollow wax figure. He looked around the room, searching the faces of his loyal board members for someone to jump to his defense, to tell me this was a mistake, to fight back against the takeover. Nobody moved a single muscle. The illusion of his omnipotence vanished in the span of 3 heartbeats. He was no longer the untouchable titan of industry. He was just a bankrupt old man, standing in a room he no longer owned. But Andre could not handle the cold reality of the situation. The golden boy, the supposed business prodigy, who had spent his entire life coasting on nepotism and unearned entitlement, finally snapped under the pressure. He pushed his chair back so violently it tipped over and crashed onto the hardwood floor. He lunged around the side of the table, his face blotchy red and sweating profusely, pointing a thick, shaking finger directly at my face. "You arrogant little witch!" Andre spat, taking heavy, aggressive steps toward me, trying to physically intimidate me just like he used to do when we were teenagers in the hallways of our childhood home. "You think you can just walk in here and steal our company? I am the vice president. I am the future of this family legacy. I have worked my entire life to build this place, and I am not going to let a bitter, jealous dropout take it away from me. I will throw you out that window myself." He did not even make it within 5 feet of me. Marcus stepped smoothly and efficiently into his path. The massive security chief pressed a heavy, muscular hand firmly against Andre's chest, stopping my brother dead in his tracks. "Sit down," Andre Marcus said, his voice low, but carrying an undeniable physical threat. "You heard the lady. She owns the building now." Andre stared at Marcus in complete disbelief, total betrayal washing over his sweaty face. The reality that the staff no longer answered to the Caldwell men broke something fundamental in his mind. He stumbled backward, his knees hitting the edge of the table, and he sank down onto the floor, looking completely winded and entirely pathetic. He was a prince who had just realized his crown was made of paper. I turned my attention away from my brother and focused on the rest of the terrified room. The men and women sitting at this table had enabled my father for decades. They had rubber-stamped his fraudulent expansion loans, they had willingly ignored the missing pension funds, and they had happily collected their exorbitant year-end bonuses while the warehouse workers struggled to pay rent. They were well-dressed parasites feeding off a dying host. "Gentlemen and ladies," I said, my voice slicing through the thick tension. "As of this exact moment, this executive board is permanently dissolved. You are all officially terminated, effective immediately. Please leave your company keycards and any corporate devices on the table before you exit the premises." The chief financial officer, a gray-haired man named Harrison, who had known me since I was a child, opened his mouth to protest. "Tara, you cannot be serious," he stammered, adjusting his expensive glasses nervously, his hands shaking. "We have guaranteed severance packages. We have ironclad employment contracts. You cannot simply wipe us out like this. We will sue you for everything you have." "You will get absolutely nothing, Harrison." I cut him off sharply, my eyes narrowing. "Your direct signatures are on the digital wire transfers that moved company money into Connor Foster's offshore hedge fund. I have already handed the entire unredacted paper trail over to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. You should not be sitting here worrying about your golden parachute severance packages. You should be rushing home to hire the best criminal defense attorneys you can find before the federal marshals show up at your front doors to arrest you for corporate embezzlement." A collective gasp echoed loudly through the room. Pure panic erupted around the mahogany table. Several of the executives actually stood up, grabbing their leather briefcases and rushing toward the doors without saying another word, realizing the ship was not just sinking, it was already at the bottom of the ocean. They shoved past my attorneys, desperate to escape the building before the authorities arrived. Within 60 seconds, the massive boardroom was entirely empty, except for me, my lawyers Marcus, my father, and my brother. I walked back to the head of the table where my father was still standing, frozen in shock. I looked at the man who had spent my entire life making me feel small and insignificant. I looked at the man who had callously fired 200 black warehouse workers just to buy my sister a luxury mansion. I systematically stripped away every single ounce of power he had ever held right in front of his eyes. "It is over, Elijah," I said, deliberately stripping away the title of father. "You have nothing left. The bank is taking your house, the feds are taking your offshore assets, and I just took your legacy. You are completely ruined." Elijah slowly reached for the edge of the table, his hands shaking so violently he could barely support his own weight. He looked completely destroyed, his broad shoulders slumped under the crushing reality of his total failure. But as the heavy silence settled over the ruined boardroom, the fragile illusion of their perfect family loyalty finally shattered completely. Andre, realizing that the board was gone and that the federal agents were likely already on their way, realized the true horror of his situation. He was the vice president. His signature was on the fraudulent documents. He was going to be the one to take the fall for the missing millions. The golden child was staring down the barrel of a decade in a federal penitentiary. Andre scrambled to his feet, his chest heaving with sheer terror. He looked at me, and then he looked at our father. The absolute panic in his eyes erased decades of obedient loyalty. He pointed a shaking, terrified finger directly at Elijah's chest, his voice cracking with pure, raw desperation. "Tell her the truth, Dad." Andre screamed, the sound tearing through the quiet boardroom. "Tell her you ordered me to do it." The heavy glass doors of the boardroom swung open just as I stepped into the hallway. A dozen federal agents wearing dark windbreakers with FBI printed in bold yellow letters swarmed past me. Their boots hit the carpet with heavy thuds, completely destroying the quiet sanctuary of the executive floor. I stood by the elevators, watching with clinical detachment as the agents stormed the room I had just left. The lead agent, a tall man with a severe expression, barked orders, commanding everyone to keep their hands visible. Through the glass, I saw Connor and Andre being forced against the mahogany table. The metallic click of handcuffs echoing into the hallway was the sweetest sound I had ever heard. My father was still kneeling on the floor, weeping uncontrollably as two agents pulled him roughly to his feet. Andre was sobbing openly, begging the agents to listen to him, swearing that he was only following orders. Connor tried to use his arrogant Wall Street voice, demanding his attorney, but an agent simply shoved his face back down onto the polished wood of the boardroom table. I rode the secondary elevator down, arriving in the lobby just in time to watch the federal agent's perp walk my brother and my brother-in-law through the main plaza. The local news vans were already waiting outside, their camera lights flashing blindingly in the humid Atlanta morning. The Golden Child and the White Savior were being broadcast to the entire world as common criminals. Employees stood in the lobby, holding their cardboard boxes of personal belongings, pointing and whispering as the great Caldwell legacy was dragged out in chains. I walked out through the private executive garage, slipping silently into the back of my waiting vehicle. The digital execution was completely flawless. Later that evening, the city lights of Atlanta glittered outside the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse. The $8 million residence was a fortress of quiet luxury high above the chaos I had unleashed that morning. I walked across the imported Italian marble floors, my heels making soft clicking sounds in the massive empty space. I was pouring myself a glass of vintage red wine at the custom kitchen island when the secure intercom on my wall buzzed loudly. My private security detail stationed in the lobby informed me that a woman claiming to be my mother was downstairs crying hysterically and demanding to be let up. I took a slow sip of the rich, dark wine, letting the flavor settle on my tongue. I told them to send Vivian up. A few minutes later, the private elevator doors opened directly into my expansive foyer. Vivian stepped out looking completely unrecognizable from the pristine country club matriarch she usually portrayed. She was wearing a designer trench coat thrown hastily over her clothes, but her hair was a tangled mess, and her expensive makeup was heavily smeared around her eyes from hours of crying. She stopped dead in her tracks, staring at the sheer massive scale and unbelievable wealth of my home. The vaulted ceilings, the contemporary artwork hanging on the walls, the panoramic view of the skyline, it completely short-circuited her brain. The daughter she had constantly called a failure, the daughter she had hidden away like a dirty secret, was living in a sky palace that made her own suburban mansion look like a cheap guest house. "Tara!" she gasped, her voice trembling violently as she stepped onto the hardwood floor. She did not even wait for me to speak. She immediately fell to her knees, her hands clasping together in a pathetic display of maternal desperation. The woman who had spent my entire life looking down her nose at me was now groveling on my expensive rug. "Tara, please, you have to stop this," she cried, tears streaming down her face and ruining what was left of her makeup. "They took your brother. They took Connor. The federal agents raided the house and the bank froze all our accounts. We cannot even buy groceries, Tara. We have absolutely nothing left. You have so much money. You have this beautiful home. Please, Tara, you have to pay their bail. You have to hire your lawyers to get them out. Please pay off the mortgage on the house. You cannot let your own family end up on the street." I slowly walked over to the velvet sofa and sat down gracefully, resting my wine glass on the heavy marble coffee table. I looked at the woman crying on my floor and felt absolutely no pity. There was no warmth left in my heart for this woman. She was merely a stranger who shared my DNA. "You want to talk about being left on the street?" I asked, my voice perfectly flat and devoid of any emotional inflection. "Let us talk about when I was 18 years old, Vivian. Let us talk about the night my appendix ruptured." Vivian stopped crying for a fraction of a second, confusion crossing her tear-stained face as she tried to recall a memory she had completely discarded. "I was lying in a hospital bed in agonizing physical pain," I said, articulating every single word with absolute precision so she could not escape the reality of her own actions. "The doctors told me I needed an emergency surgery or the infection would become lethal. I had no health insurance because Elijah had kicked me off his corporate plan. I needed $5,000 to cover the upfront hospital bill. I called you crying in pain, begging for my own mother to help me. I begged you to pay the hospital so they could stop the agony. Do you remember what you did, Vivian?" She looked away, staring at the floor, her hands trembling as the ugly truth surfaced in her mind. "You took that $5,000 and you spent it on a customized swan ice sculpture for Brianna's debutante ball." I continued, my voice slicing through the quiet penthouse. You told me over the phone while I was literally screaming in pain that you could not spare the cash because you could not look poor in front of the Jack and Jill Society. You said the catering budget was already stretched too thin. You left your own 18-year-old daughter to suffer in a charity ward and deal with vicious medical debt collectors for 5 consecutive years just so your favorite child could have frozen water sitting on a buffet table. You did not care if I ended up on the street then. Vivian let out a loud sobbing wail, crawling forward slightly on the rug. I am sorry, Tara, she cried, reaching out her trembling hands toward my shoes. I was wrong. We were all wrong. I was just trying to keep the family image together. Your father demanded perfection. But please, Tara, you have to let us keep the house. It is my home. It is where I raised you. It is all I have left in this entire world. Do not take my home away from me. I picked up my wine glass and took another slow, deliberate sip, savoring the complex taste of the vintage before looking back down at her pathetic form. You do not have a house, Vivian, I stated calmly. She froze, staring at me with wide, terrified eyes. I seized the deed to that property 3 weeks ago, when Elijah defaulted on the leveraged collateral loans. I explained, enjoying the absolute devastation dawning on her face. I owned your mortgage, Vivian, and I already sold the entire property to a massive commercial real estate developer. No, she whispered, shaking her head frantically. No, Tara, please. The bulldozers are scheduled to arrive on Monday morning at 6 o'clock. I continued, ignoring her pleas completely. They are turning your precious country club mansion and that immaculate rose garden you love so much into a massive concrete parking lot for a discount strip mall. The eviction notice has already been posted on your front gate. You have until Sunday night to pack whatever fits in the trunk of your car because everything else belongs to the bank. Vivian's eyes rolled back and she collapsed onto the floor, letting out a hysterical, agonizing scream of pure devastation. She curled into a tight ball, weeping loudly, her entire world completely and utterly annihilated. The country club matriarch was dead. She was just another homeless woman crying on the floor. I stood up and walked toward the kitchen, dismissing her entirely, just as my highly secure cell phone began to vibrate aggressively on the marble counter. It was an urgent incoming call from my lead defense attorney. The flashing screen indicated top priority. I left Vivian sobbing on the rug and walked over to answer the phone. I pressed the answer button and listened as my attorney's voice came through the speaker, tight with sudden tension and rapid urgency. Tara, we have a massive problem, he said quickly, the background noise of the federal courthouse echoing behind his words. Connor just refused his initial booking and requested an immediate private meeting with the federal prosecutors. He bypassed his own defense team entirely. I narrowed my eyes, staring out at the city skyline. What is he doing? I asked, my voice cold and steady. He is trying to strike an immediate immunity plea deal with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. My attorney explained, his tone deadly serious. He is giving them a massive cache of highly sophisticated fabricated digital documents. He is claiming that you are the true mastermind behind the entire money laundering operation. He is telling the feds that you hacked his systems and forced him to move the money. The heavy oak doors of the federal courthouse swung closed behind me, sealing the absolute fate of the Caldwell family. The massive courtroom gallery was packed shoulder to shoulder with local investigative reporters, former warehouse employees who had lost their pensions, and the absolute elite of Atlanta society who had come specifically to watch the spectacular public execution of my father's grand illusion. The air in the room was thick with anticipation and the quiet murmurs of people waiting for blood. I sat perfectly still in the very front row, directly behind the federal prosecution table. I was wearing an immaculate, custom-tailored white suit, a deliberate and highly calculated visual contrast to the dark, somber tones of the mahogany courtroom and the bright orange jumpsuits my brother and my brother-in-law were currently wearing. I felt absolutely no anxiety and no remorse. I had patiently engineered every single second of this day, and I was finally going to watch the empire burn to the ground. The federal judge, A severe-looking woman with iron gray hair and absolutely no patience for Wall Street predators or entitled heirs entered the room and slammed her heavy wooden gavel onto the sounding block. The sharp crack echoed off the high marble walls, demanding total silence. She called Andre's name first. My brother stood up on shaking legs, looking completely hollowed out and entirely pathetic. The perfectly groomed vice president of Caldwell Logistics, the golden child who could do no wrong, was entirely gone. In his place was just a terrified boy drowning in the rough fabric of an oversized prison uniform. He kept his head bowed, unable to look at the gallery or the judge. The judge read through his extensive charges of corporate fraud and embezzlement, her voice sharp and unforgiving. She detailed how he had willingly signed away the livelihoods of hundreds of workers just to maintain his luxury cars and his country club status. She did not hesitate or show a single ounce of leniency when she handed down a definitive sentence of 5 years in a federal penitentiary. Andre collapsed back into his heavy wooden chair and broke down crying openly in front of the entire crowded gallery. The sound of his loud, desperate sobbing filled the silent courtroom. He turned his head, looking wildly toward the back rows, searching for our mother, hoping for one last glance of comfort or protection. Vivian was sitting tightly in the far corner, wearing a dark coat and looking older than I had ever seen her. But when Andre's pleading, tear-filled eyes finally found her, Vivian slowly turned her head away, completely unable to look at the ruined son she had worshipped and protected her entire life. She was abandoning him in his darkest moment, just as she had abandoned me in the hospital years ago. Connor was forced to stand next. He tried desperately to maintain his arrogant Wall Street posture, his chin tilted upward in a pathetic display of defiance. But the sheer crushing weight of the federal justice system was visibly destroying him. The judge looked down at him with an expression of absolute, profound disgust. She detailed his elaborate wire fraud, his complex money laundering through the Cayman Islands, and the incredibly stupid perjury he had committed when he tried to frame me in the FBI interrogation room. The judge made it very clear that his false statements and his arrogant attempt to obstruct justice had completely destroyed whatever minimal leniency he might have originally received. "You brought a staggering level of greed and corruption into this community," the judge stated, her voice echoing with righteous anger. "You exploited a family business and attempted to destroy an innocent woman to cover your own tracks." The judge struck her gavel and sentenced him to 12 consecutive years in federal prison without the possibility of early parole. Connor went completely rigid, his face draining of all blood, as the reality of losing over a decade of his life washed over him. His knees buckled slightly, and he had to grip the defense table to keep from falling over. Far in the back of the courtroom, hiding behind cheap, oversized sunglasses, sat my sister Brianna. She was wearing a faded trench coat, clutching a discount handbag, having already filed for rapid bankruptcy and a quiet, immediate divorce. Her pristine, wealthy influencer lifestyle was completely dead. She sat there in the shadows and watched her brilliant golden husband get dragged away toward a holding cell without shedding a single tear. Finally, the heavy gaze of the federal judge turned to Elijah Caldwell. My father stood up, grasping the edge of the defense table with violently trembling hands, just to keep himself upright. The great patriarch, the untouchable king of Atlanta society, looked like a fragile, broken shell of an old man. The judge addressed him directly, staring down at him from her high bench. She stated that because of the extensive digital evidence provided by my holding company, the court officially recognized that he had been manipulated by his son and son-in-law. Because of my meticulous documentation proving his profound financial ignorance and his complete lack of technical understanding regarding the offshore accounts, he was miraculously avoiding federal prison. My father let out a loud, ragged gasp of relief, his shoulders dropping as he thought he had survived the ordeal. But the mercy of the court ended exactly there. The judge raised her voice, cutting through his momentary relief. She slammed her gavel down with terrifying force, declaring a strict lifetime ban, preventing Elijah from ever operating, managing, serving on a board, or owning any business entity in the United States ever again. Furthermore, she ordered the immediate and total stripping of all his remaining personal and corporate assets to pay full restitution to the defrauded pension fund and the federal government. The words hung in the sterile air of the silent courtroom, stripped of all assets. It meant the luxury cars, the hidden bank accounts, the precious country club shares, and the massive Cascade estate were completely gone. Elijah stared up at the judge, his mouth opening and closing wordlessly, as he tried to process the absolute devastation of his reality. He was officially a broke, disgraced man in the eyes of the exact high society he had sacrificed his own children to impress. He was a king without a kingdom, without a penny to his name, and without an ounce of respect from the people who used to fear him. Suddenly, my father grabbed the fabric of his tailored suit jacket right over his heart. He let out a sharp, ragged gasp, his face turning a terrifying shade of ashen gray. The realization that he had traded his entire empire and his family for an absolute mirage finally triggered a violent physical response. He stumbled backward, his knees buckling as a mild panic attack seized his chest, tightening his lungs and cutting off his oxygen. He collapsed heavily into his wooden chair, clutching his heart and gasping loudly for air. The bailiffs and court medics rushed forward in a chaotic, sudden panic, shouting for people to stand back. I sat perfectly still in the front row, my legs crossed elegantly in my tailored white suit, resting my hands quietly in my lap. I simply watched him gasp and wheeze, surrounded by panicked strangers. I did not move a single muscle to help him. I did not feel a single drop of sympathy. He was finally paying the exact price for his towering arrogance. 2 weeks later, the heavy, humid morning air hung quietly over the pristine, immaculate streets of the exclusive gated community. The massive iron gates of the Cascade estate stood wide open, no longer protecting the secrets of the people inside. Idling heavily on the polished cobblestone driveway, right in front of the towering white columns of the mansion, was a rented moving truck. It was eviction day. The heavy rented moving truck sat idling on the pristine cobblestone driveway, leaking dark oil onto the perfectly manicured stones. The blistering, humid Atlanta sun beat down mercilessly on my parents as they carried cheap cardboard boxes out of the massive front doors of the Cascade estate. There were no professional movers and no hired domestic staff to assist them with the heavy lifting. Their bank accounts were completely frozen by the federal government, and their limitless black credit cards had been immediately declined. Vivian was struggling with a poorly taped box of cheap kitchen supplies, her designer clothes replaced by sweat-stained, faded cotton. She looked exhausted and entirely hollowed out. Elijah looked like a ghost haunting his own ruined property, hauling black plastic garbage bags filled with whatever meager personal possessions the federal authorities had allowed them to keep. They were being forcibly relocated to a cramped 2-bedroom apartment in a decaying building on the far industrial outskirts of the city, a place where the air always smelled of exhaust and the streetlights were permanently broken. As they loaded their pathetic remnants into the back of the hot truck, a sleek silver Bentley slowly rolled past the open iron gates. It was the president of the exclusive country club and his wife. Vivian looked up, wiping sweat from her forehead, hoping for a sympathetic wave or a comforting smile from her former high society friends. Instead, the Bentley accelerated the wealthy couple inside, deliberately turning their heads away and completely ignoring the ruined Caldwell family. They were social pariahs, radioactive and entirely invisible to the world they used to rule. A long shadow fell over the driveway as my custom black Maybach glided smoothly to a stop right behind their rusted rental truck. The low, powerful purr of the luxury engine commanded the entire space. My private driver opened the heavy armored door, and I stepped out onto the driveway, wearing a flawless, tailored white silk suit that cost more than my parents' new annual rent. I was there to physically sign off on the final property handover documents, ensuring the immediate demolition of the estate. Elijah stopped dead in his tracks, dropping a plastic bag of clothes onto the hot pavement. He looked completely shattered. His thick, dark hair had turned almost entirely white in the span of 2 weeks, and the proud, aggressive posture he had carried his entire life had completely collapsed into a pathetic stoop. He stumbled toward me, his shoulders hunched and his eyes red and swollen. He stopped a few feet away from me, looking at my pristine tailored suit and my unshakable composure. "I was wrong, Tara," my father sobbed, his voice breaking into a pathetic wet wheeze. The tears spilled freely down his aging cheeks, falling onto the hot cobblestone driveway. "You were the only one who truly had the Caldwell excellence. You are brilliant. You are my greatest achievement. Please, Tara, you have to forgive me. I am so sorry for everything I did to you." I looked at the broken, weeping man who had tormented me for 3 decades. I searched my soul for even a single microscopic drop of sadness or regret or familial love. There was absolutely nothing. I felt lighter than air. "I did not do this to prove myself to you, Dad," I said, my voice carrying absolutely zero emotion, a flat, dead calm that made him physically flinch. "I did this to surgically remove a lethal tumor from my life. I am not your legacy, and I am absolutely not your achievement. I am entirely my own. From this exact moment forward, I have absolutely no family." I turned my back on him without waiting for a response and stepped back into the climate-controlled sanctuary of my vehicle. I did not look back as the heavy tinted window rolled up silently, cutting off the sound of his desperate weeping. My driver pulled the Maybach smoothly out of the iron gates, leaving the ruins of the Caldwell dynasty suffocating in the hot morning sun. 1 exact year later, the crisp autumn air whipped across the massive outdoor balcony of my new corporate headquarters. I stood 40 stories above Wall Street, looking down at the financial capital of the world. The space behind me was filled with the vibrant electric energy of 200 young, brilliant Black women. They were software engineers, aggressive financial analysts, startup founders, and bold visionaries. I walked up to the crystal podium, the sharp clicking of my heels commanding absolute silence across the sprawling rooftop. I looked out at the sea of brilliant faces and announced the official launch of a $50 million venture capital incubator fund. It was a massive financial initiative designed specifically to fund and empower marginalized women who had been chronically overlooked, dismissed, or actively abused by their own families in toxic communities. The crowd erupted into deafening applause, the sound echoing off the surrounding Manhattan skyscrapers. I stepped back from the microphone, taking a glass of expensive vintage champagne from a silver tray held by a passing waiter. They called me a disgrace for 32 years because I absolutely refused to be a silent prop in their grand fake empire. They starved me of affection and isolated me in the dark, genuinely thinking it would make me weak and compliant. They did not realize that when you violently strip a woman of absolutely everything she has to lose, you do not break her, you make her completely invincible. The sweetest and most absolute revenge is never about destroying your enemies with your own hands. It is about stepping back and letting their own internal rot completely consume them from the inside out, while you quietly use their ashes to build your own unbreakable kingdom. I raised my crystal glass of champagne toward the shining skyline, taking a slow, deeply satisfying sip as the brilliant sun set over my new empire. The most profound lesson from Tara's journey is that true empowerment springs from radical independence, when toxic families condition their love on blind obedience and weaponize their approval. Staying in their shadow guarantees a lifetime of misery. Tara proves that rejection is not a death sentence. It is the ultimate catalyst for immense growth by surgically removing herself from her family's manipulative games and fake empire. She discovered her own invincible strength. True revenge is never about destroying your abusers. Instead, it is strictly about using the ashes of their betrayal to build your own unshakable, brilliant kingdom and legacy. If you have ever had to walk away from a toxic environment to build your own success, share your story in the comments below and subscribe for more empowering content.